It's a sunny afternoon on June 1st, 1936, on the New York Harbor waterfront. A police officer named Gene stands in front of a barricaded area, facing a large crowd. Gene is protecting a private marina, one of the best views of the harbor, and any moment now, a highly anticipated sight is due to arrive, the world's newest and most luxurious ocean liner, RMS Queen Mary. But the crowd is trying to get past Gene and onto private property for a better look. A balding man is at the front, mere inches from Gene's face. He tries to reason with him. Look, this area is off limits. You need to go somewhere else. There is nowhere else. Everywhere's full. We just need a place to stand and watch. No, you all need to move back. These people just want to witness a piece of history, officer. We're not going to hurt nothing. The Queen Mary is a state-of-the-art passenger ship owned and operated by the British Cunard Line. Crowds have filled every possible vantage point in New York to witness the end of her maiden voyage. But with the excitement the ship's arrival is generating, Gene fears he's about to lose control of the crowd. Now look, if you don't back up, I'm going to start making arrests. Oh, come on, we just came to watch the ship arrive, then we'll be on our way. I don't care. This is private property. At the mighty blast of a ship's horn, both Gene and the crowd fall silent. And then, Gene is suddenly overwhelmed by the crowd rushing past him. Any chance of controlling them is hopeless. Gene can only turn and follow the others to the water's edge, where the view of the harbor opens up. The sight that greets him stops Gene in his tracks. 300 yards away in the harbor, a gigantic ocean liner glides effortlessly through the water. Dozens of smaller boats surround the Queen Mary to get a closer look, but they seem like toys in comparison. Above her sleek black hull, the white decks are packed with hundreds of waving passengers. And lining the center of the grand ship are 3 huge smokestacks painted bright red. The crowd around Gene erupts into cheers, and Gene finds himself clapping too, overwhelmed by the beauty and power of this ship. He glances to his right and finds himself once again standing next to the balding man from the front of the crowd. The man leans in close so Gene can hear him. You still gonna arrest us? Gene only grins. I'll let you off with a warning this time. Gosh, isn't she magnificent? Can you imagine traveling on a ship like that? Not on a police salary, no. The men fall silent again, watching the Queen Mary sweep by. The liner sounds her horn as she heads toward her mooring on the Hudson River, churning waters glistening in her wake. Gene shakes his head. Maybe it's time I switch careers. A few months after her maiden voyage, the Queen Mary captured the Blue Ribbon, the unofficial title awarded to the fastest ship to cross the Atlantic Ocean. But it wasn't just the Queen Mary's speed that made the liner famous. Her style and elegance won admirers both in Europe and America. And as the Cunard Line's largest and most luxurious ship, the Queen Mary was a floating emblem of the company's success, the latest triumphant addition to a legacy that stretched back almost a century, to an age when steamships were still new technology and the shipping industry was ripe for disruption. From Wondery, I'm Lindsey Graham, and this is Business Movers. Few companies in the history of the United Kingdom have been more entwined with the country's national pride, security, and economic health than the iconic Cunard shipping line. Aboard the firm's timeless and instantly recognizable red, white, and black ships, Cunard has carried mail across the waters, ferried immigrants to new lives, shipped troops to battlefields, and provided first-class travel for actors, authors, kings, and queens. Today, Cunard Line is owned and operated by the Carnival conglomerate, whose annual revenues run well into the billions of dollars. Cunard is now predominantly a luxury cruise service, carrying its international clientele to and from some of the world's most glamorous locations. But Cunard was founded in a very different time. Cunard began in the mid-19th century when a prominent British-Canadian businessman saw a new opportunity in a revolutionary technology, the steam engine. Samuel Cunard believed a new type of ship would replace the dominant sail-powered vessels of the time. While paddle steamers were still equipped with canvas sails, their large wooden hulls were also flanked by giant wheels spun by steam engines, which propelled the ships through the water at unprecedented speeds. By the 1830s, these paddle steamers were already being used to transport supplies up and down the coasts of North America and Great Britain. But a regular, reliable steamship service across the Atlantic was yet to be established. Samuel thought he could be the first one to take advantage of this gap in the market and usher in a new era of transportation. And soon, Samuel was about to disrupt the shipping industry with a technology that some still thought impossibly dangerous. He couldn't have known that the company bearing his name would flourish for more than a century until ship travel itself would be disrupted by an even more impossible-seeming technology, the jet airplane. But long before humanity took to the skies, Samuel was just a man with an idea. To turn his idea into reality, though, he needed steamships. And to build steamships, Samuel needed money. This is the first episode in our 4-part series on Cunard, Full Head of Steam. It's a summer afternoon in 1838 in Boston Harbor, 98 years before the maiden voyage of RMS Queen Mary. 50-year-old Nova Scotia businessman Samuel Cunard steps along the well-worn boardwalk in stride with a shipowner named George. George is showing off his latest acquisition to Samuel, an impressive sailing ship that will provide services up and down the North American and Atlantic coast. But Samuel doesn't really care about George's ship. He's here for another reason, George's money. But to get his hands on it, Samuel first needs to patiently listen to the end of George's monologue. And I couldn't think of any finer name, no more fitting name for such a ship than Aphrodite, the ancient Greek goddess of beauty. Well, she certainly is a beauty, isn't she? Wait till you see the inside. George is about to head up the gangplank when Samuel stops him. George, I must confess something. I've gotten you here under false pretenses. Impressive though the Aphrodite is, I didn't want to meet with you just to see the ship. Oh, business is it? That's right. All righty then, Sam. How can I help you? Well, to put it bluntly, George, I'm here to ask for an investment. I want your help in transforming travel across the Atlantic. I'm inviting you to help me create an ocean railway. I'm afraid, Sam, I believe trains will have a lot of trouble floating. Not at all. They actually already exist. They're called steamships. Oh, I was afraid this is where you were going. Steamships are a fad, Sam, and a dangerous one. I believe they're not. Who would want to trust their cargo, let alone their lives, to a ship with an engine that could explode at any moment in the middle of the ocean? Give me a trusty mainsail and a strong breeze any day. No, I get it, but I've become very familiar with the technology over the past few years. It's developed a lot, and I'm telling you, it's sound. Is that why the Royal William was such a success? Samuel pauses, thrown off by George's remark. The Royal William was a steamship designed to carry mail and cargo from Quebec to Halifax. Samuel invested heavily in it, but the business collapsed. Well, you're right to bring that up, William. I don't blame you. Still, its failures were due to human mismanagement, not the ship's engines. George scoffs, but Samuel isn't ready to give up just yet. Look, George, these ships are fast. They can hit 8 knots or more in all types of weather. No, I'm sorry, Sam. Right now, it takes a month to sail across the Atlantic. There are already a few steamships making the journey in just 16 days. I think I can get that time even lower. Well, that sounds more frightening than exciting. Well, respectfully, George, you are wrong about this. The engines work marvelously, and I'm afraid your sailing ships will be left far behind. George turns away from Samuel, thinking. His eyes rest on his new ship, the Aphrodite. Well, you may be right, Sam, and if you are, I suppose I'll retire a bit less wealthy than I had intended. But I'll spend that retirement sailing at a leisurely pace. There's just something about the old ways. Samuel looks down, disappointed, and George feels a pang of guilt. Would you like to come aboard the Aphrodite still? We can have a glass of wine on deck. It is a fine day. Well, thank you, George, but I just can't. I have several more appointments today. So goodbye, George, and good luck. She really is a lovely ship. Samuel Cunard left the dock in a hurry, late for his next meeting with another potential investor. Samuel was convinced that he was right about steamship technology, but this was not his first rejection. But his quest for investment would soon gain new urgency. Only a few months later, a competition would be announced by the British government to establish a steamship mail service across the Atlantic. A race was about to begin, and Samuel Cunard was determined to win it. In November 1838, the government in London announced that it was seeking bids from steamship companies to run a new mail service between Britain and North America. It was an opportunity that immediately caught Samuel Cunard's eye. Samuel thought it was the perfect chance to kickstart what he called the Ocean Railway. But there was a problem. By the time the announcement of the competition made it to Nova Scotia, it was already January 1839, and the deadlines for submissions to the British government had passed. But Samuel still didn't give up. Immediately, he boarded the next sailing ship bound for Britain. He hoped that his competition in Europe had failed to secure the government contract and that there might still be time for him to win it instead. He was right about the timing, but Samuel did not have any ships or investors yet. To win the competition, Samuel knew he'd have to correct at least one of these shortcomings. So having tried and failed to secure investment in North America, Samuel changed his tactics. Instead of chasing financing first, he decided to place an order with a shipbuilder and then try to use that agreement to secure the contract with the British government. With the ships and a mail service contract in hand, Samuel was sure his luck with investors would then improve. So once Samuel reached England, he didn't head to London to negotiate with the government. Instead, he headed north to the Scottish port of Glasgow, one of the greatest shipbuilding cities in the world. There, he met with a yard owner named Robert Napier. The two quickly agreed on a contract: 4 wooden steamships weighing 960 tons for a price of £32,000 each, roughly $5 million today. With an agreement secured with the shipyard, Samuel next needed to win the all-important mail contract. He hadn't crossed the Atlantic on a whim, though. Samuel had a friend on the inside. Samuel and Sir Edward Parry had become friends 20 years earlier when Sir Edward was stationed in Halifax with the Royal Navy. Now Sir Edward was the admiral in charge of converting the Navy's ships from sail power to steam. But that was not his only responsibility. He was also the man who would decide the winner of the contest. And once he saw Samuel's order for the ships from Glasgow, Sir Edward was happy to award his old friend the sought-after contract. The British government agreed to pay Samuel £55,000 per year, $9 million today, to deliver the mail between the United Kingdom and North America. Samuel now had an order placed with the shipyard and a mailing contract with the government. Now all he needed was the money to actually pay for the ships and get them built. But Samuel was optimistic when he met with potential financiers in London and Liverpool. Surely they would see the strength of his business plan. But to Samuel's surprise, he again received little interest. He needed to move quickly, though. Despite his friendship with Sir Edward, unless Samuel got the project off the ground soon, he knew he could still have the contract taken from him. So yet again, Samuel changed tactics. He thought that his best bet was to go back to Glasgow and seek help from the one man who has as much to gain from this project as Samuel did, the shipbuilder Robert Napier. And seeing that his new ship orders might be in danger, Robert was happy to help. He connected Samuel with men in Glasgow who were already running small fleets of steamers along the British coast. And this time, Samuel's efforts were more successful, securing backing from 2 other wealthy men. But even their combined resources were not enough to finance the ambitious and costly endeavor on their own. Samuel and his new partners still needed more help. But now that Samuel had some investors, he found things easier. Each man that came on board gave confidence to the next investor to also take a chance. And over the next few months, Samuel managed to secure 33 additional investors, raising a total of £300,000. Samuel named this new enterprise the British and North American Royal Mail Steam Packet Company. He was one step closer to finally realizing his dream of creating his ocean railway. And news of Samuel's success traveled quickly, making it back to his hometown of Halifax, Nova Scotia before he did. The locals were delighted. Previously, mail took about a month to travel between Nova Scotia, a British colony, and the mother country. Now the time for letters and packages to reach the United Kingdom would be cut in half. Quicker communications meant tremendous new opportunities for business in North America, and when Samuel finally returned from England in August 1839, the citizens of Halifax celebrated with a dinner in his honor. Samuel, of course, was asked to make a speech, and in Samuel's time, any man of his status was expected to be a great orator. Long, grandiose speeches were par for the course. But Samuel did not enjoy public speaking, so he only spoke briefly at the dinner and modestly gave credit for the new service entirely to the British government. Samuel's mind may have been elsewhere. In just 8 months, he would need to have ships ready to carry mail across the Atlantic by steam, and that was a tall order. Back in Britain, Samuel instructed his shipbuilder, Robert Napier, to prioritize engineering quality over visual appeal. He wanted to ensure his paddle ships would pass through inspection by the Royal Navy. As far as Samuel was concerned, the interiors could be left plain so long as the ships themselves were well built. And as he scrutinized the plans for his new vessels, Samuel focused the bulk of his attention on his flagship, the Britannia. Samuel was fiercely loyal to Britain, and he felt it was only appropriate that his most prized ship pay homage to the country. On February 5, 1840, the Britannia was launched into the Clyde River in Glasgow. By the standards of the day, she was a large ship, 207 feet long and 34 feet wide, but it would be another 5 months before the Britannia was ready for her maiden voyage. Her first port of call was Halifax, Nova Scotia, and then she traveled on down the coast to Boston. In addition to 93 crew members, the Britannia carried 60 passengers on her first crossing, including Samuel Cunard and his daughter Anne. The other 3 steamships Samuel had ordered soon followed the Britannia into the water. The Acadia, Columbia, and Caledonia filled out Samuel's fleet. The speed and reliability of the new service he built saw the number of passengers on each Atlantic crossing steadily increase too. The simple interiors of the new ships didn't seem to put people off either. Even celebrities were among the early passengers. In January 1842, the world-famous author Charles Dickens made his first trip to the United States aboard the Britannia, accompanied by his wife. But while the Britannia's passengers and crew mingled with the rich and famous, the ship's owner was concealing a secret. Many assumed that Samuel was one of the wealthiest men in Nova Scotia. Prior to the founding of his steamship company, that may have been true. Now, though, Samuel was cash poor. Despite the growing popularity of his ocean railway, profits at the new shipping firm were coming up short. Samuel's debtors were ready to collect, and soon his only option to save himself and his company would be to run. It's March 1842 at the dockside in Liverpool, England, 2 years after the maiden voyage of the steamship Britannia, and Samuel Cunard is in trouble. The 54-year-old lies at the bottom of a small rowboat tied up at the dock. The boat belongs to a friend and business associate named Duncan Gibb. As a boatman holds the little vessel steady, Duncan takes a seat next to Samuel. "Mr. Cunard, perhaps this has gone too far. Maybe we ought to face the music. I just need a few moments of your help and then I'll be out of your hair. Is she still at the dock?" Duncan looks across the water to one of Samuel's steamships preparing to depart. Samuel is on the passenger list, but he hasn't boarded yet. He's deeply in debt, and his British creditors have come to the pier to demand payments Samuel can't make. Samuel hopes that once they realize he's not on board, they'll give up the chase, and then Samuel can secretly board the steamer out at sea. But to do that, he needs Duncan and his boat. "Mr. Cunard, if you're so confident that the business can recover, then perhaps you should negotiate. I've tried, but I'm afraid the time for negotiations is over. There are at least 5 men aboard that ship with writs of execution. If they get their hands on me, I'm finished. Nova Scotia is the only place that's safe now. But are you not just delaying the inevitable? If you help me here, Duncan, if I can get aboard that ship, then the business will survive, and the creditors will be paid." "Well, all right." Duncan turns toward his boatman. "Let's get ready." Simultaneously, the Cunard steamer begins to move slowly away from the dock, and Duncan leans down to update Samuel. "All right, she's leaving." "Okay, just wait." Steam spews from the ship's smokestacks as she heads away from dock. "Now, Samuel, if we wait too long, you'll miss your chance. There's only so fast we can row." "Not yet. We need to go. Just a little longer. Samuel, we're going to miss it. Just wait." And right at that moment, several small rowboats emerge from around the far side of the steamer. They're carrying the creditors, who've waited until the very last second to leave the ship and give up their search. Their boats head back toward the shore. "They're leaving, Samuel. They're leaving. All right, go. Now go." The boatman pushes them off, and he and Duncan begin rowing as fast as they can. They gain on the steamer, but it's accelerating as it heads out to sea. It's no use, Samuel. She's too fast for us. Keep going. Just a little longer. We can't row faster than a steamer." But then Duncan notices that the ship is slowing down. "Samuel, it's slowing. What does that mean?" "It means they've received my message." As the rowboat closes in on the steamer, Samuel sits up. A crew member appears on the steamer's deck above and lowers a rope ladder down the side of the hull. Samuel stands on the edge of the rowboat and puts a hand on the ladder. Then he turns back to Duncan. "Well, thank you, Mr. Gibb. I tell you, you've saved my business. Well, the next time I see you, I hope it's under better circumstances. I will make sure of it." By 1842, Samuel Cunard owed over $23 million in modern money. Most of these debts predated his steamship business. A land purchase had gone wrong, and his family had suffered the effects of a wider economic depression. Samuel had hoped the mail contract with the British government would improve his cash flow, but this endeavor had produced lower than expected profits. Now, though, Samuel had bought himself some time. By escaping his English creditors, he had around 2 weeks of tranquility as the steamer made its way across the Atlantic. It was the perfect setting for Samuel to think of a way to dig himself out of the largest financial hole of his lifetime. When Samuel Cunard reached the shores of Nova Scotia, he immediately set to work tackling his debt. His first move was to raise cash by selling off some assets. Samuel sold a tract of land he owned on Prince Edward Island, as well as a farm outside of Quebec. These sales allowed him to make some repayments and keep his head above water, but they only made a small dent in the total of what he owed. Samuel needed much more financial assistance to get back on track. The best way he thought to do that was to refinance the bulk of his debt with a loan from another bank. Luckily, Samuel had established a good relationship with the up-and-coming Bank of Nova Scotia. Samuel had once been an agent of the General Mining Association, one of the bank's most important clients. And when it looked like the GMA might take its banking business elsewhere, Samuel stepped in and convinced the association to continue working with the Bank of Nova Scotia. Samuel figured that the bank managers owed him a favor, and now Samuel was going to call it in. But still, Samuel was asking for a lot. The amount he needed was £45,000, roughly $8 million today, and an enormous sum for an individual at the time. The loan amount was so great that the board of the bank had to hold a special meeting to decide whether or not to grant it. But despite referring to Samuel's state of affairs as embarrassed, the bank ultimately agreed to give Samuel the money. But in order to receive the funds, Samuel had to put up collateral. In response, he pledged virtually everything he owned to the Bank of Nova Scotia, including all the stock in his shipping company and even his home furniture. But that wasn't the only condition that Samuel had to swallow to get his hands on the money. Word of his escape from Liverpool had spread, and it made his new creditors in Nova Scotia anxious. To prevent Samuel running from debt again, the Bank of Nova Scotia made his loan conditional on Samuel not leaving Halifax, leaving the man who had ushered in the era of transatlantic steam travel forbidden to leave the shores of his home country. But Samuel was too relieved to be upset. Now he had the funds to pay off his old creditors, and he could focus entirely on his steamship company. Unable to leave Nova Scotia, Samuel arranged for his son and cousin to travel to and from England, conducting business on his behalf. And luckily, that business was soon booming. 1842's low profits proved to be an outlier. Over the course of the next 5 years, the British and North American Royal Mail Steam Packet Company came to dominate trade on the North Atlantic. The company's growing passenger and mail-carrying services generated reliable profits, and Samuel was able to pay down his remaining debts substantially. And by 1850, Samuel's fleet had grown from 4 steamships to 12. The company's expansion meant it required more of his time and attention, though. And since most of the company's shareholders were located in Liverpool, it became clear to Samuel that he needed to relocate to England. With his debts cleared, though, the Bank of Nova Scotia removed the restrictions on his movement, and Samuel soon officially called London his permanent home. But while Samuel had moved east across the Atlantic, the vast majority of passenger travel was now flowing in the opposite direction. Many poorer Europeans were unhappy, underfed, and underemployed. By contrast, the United States was rapidly expanding westward and needed all the manpower it could get. The result was that over the course of the 1850s, around 3 million immigrants crossed the Atlantic in search of a new life in America, and many of them traveled aboard Samuel Cunard steamships. But Samuel's lucrative business was soon interrupted. In 1854, Great Britain found itself at war. The Russians were battling Turkey for control of the Crimean Peninsula, and Britain and France joined the Turkish side in the conflict. The war was taking place thousands of miles away from the Atlantic Ocean, but the effect on Samuel's fleet would be severe. The contract with the Royal Mail included a special clause that required Samuel to make his ships available to the British government during wartime. Samuel did not complain, though. He was a patriot, and Britain badly needed ships to transport troops and supplies. So 14 of Samuel's steamers, essentially the entire fleet, were devoted to the war effort. Some were outfitted to carry soldiers, others for horses, and one became a dedicated hospital ship. Having his ships conscripted meant that Samuel's steamers had to be withdrawn from transatlantic service, and this could hardly have come at a worse time. Not only was the number of passengers surging, competition had begun to enter the market as well. The Crimean War seemed to present Samuel's rivals with the perfect opportunity to supplant him. But Samuel's decision to support the British war effort proved to have the opposite effect. His sacrifice for the national good won him the admiration and respect of both the British government and its citizens. When the war ended in early 1856 and Samuel's fleet returned to the North Atlantic, British customers rewarded Samuel by flocking back to his ships. His company immediately reclaimed its place as the leader in transatlantic steamship travel, and a new era began for a company that was almost now universally known as the Cunard Line. Some 7 years after the Crimean War, Samuel Cunard retired at the age of 76 and passed control to his son Edward. 2 years later, Samuel died, leaving behind a company that seemed in good health. But just 4 years after his death, Samuel's son Edward Cunard also died unexpectedly at the age of 53. And even while the company was still reeling from this loss, a new competitor entered the waters. The White Star Line began to offer more luxurious, comfortable, and faster transatlantic crossings than Cunard. The emergence of this rival kick-started a furious period of development and innovation in ship design as the two companies competed to build bigger and better ships. Over the decades that followed, Samuel Cunard's humble, mail-carrying wooden paddle steamers were transformed into huge, steel-hulled luxury liners, ships that seemed more like floating hotels than the floating trains Samuel once dreamed of. So by the end of the 1800s, the Cunard Line had grown into one of Britain's most important and prestigious companies. The 20th century then began with a golden age for ocean liners. The average transatlantic crossing time had been cut to under 6 days. Passenger numbers were only rising, and magnificent new ships were taking to the seas. But this new era would take a dark turn. Tragedy, war, and technological revolutions would all threaten transatlantic travel and endanger the future of the company so carefully built by its founder, Samuel Cunard. It's August 1914 at Cunard's central office in Liverpool, England, almost a half-century after the death of the company's founder, Sir Samuel Cunard. 35-year-old Percy Bates, the managing director of the Cunard Line, enters the company's telegraph room. Banks of machinery line the walls and teams of wireless operators hunch over their sets. These men handle communications with all Cunard ships at sea. Percy barks an order. "We need a message out to all westbound ships, gentlemen. Start with Mauritania, please." The door behind him swings open, and Cunard's deputy director, Percy's younger brother Dennis, enters the room. "Hey, just a minute, Percy. What is it? There's no time to waste." Britain has just declared war on Germany, and 20 Cunard ships have been called into military service. Many of those liners are out at sea, however, where they are now vulnerable to attack by the German Navy. Percy needs to get them safely into harbor. "Tell the Mauritania to change course and make a dash for Halifax. She has to get into port as quickly as possible. Tell her to dim lights." "Percy, no, the fog is too thick. I have weather reports. There are already German U-boats out there. Any liner with a British flag is a target. We've got to get our ships to port. But the Mauritania can outrun any U-boat. If every ship out there dims her lights, it'll be chaos. They could smash into each other in the fog. It'd be a worse disaster than Titanic." But Percy isn't deterred. He repeats his commands. "Instruct all our ships to dim their lights. Engines must be run all ahead full. They're to head for the nearest safe port, unload, and return to Britain as quickly as possible." "Percy, no, I'm begging you to pause for just a moment and think this through. You're going to cause chaos out there. Dennis, war is chaos, and hesitation means death. Oh, listen to yourself. You're not an admiral." Percy grabs the door and pulls it open in frustration. "Dennis, please leave." "Oh, come now. Lives depend on us, Dennis. We have to act quickly. You're right, I'm not an admiral, but Britain needs ships, and I have them. And I'm going to get them here as quickly as possible. Now please go." Dennis shakes his head. "Fine, but we had better pray our ship survive this." The telegraph operators share awkward glances over the brothers' argument. Percy gathers himself before turning to the men again. "Right, gentlemen, let's begin with Mauritania." When Percy Bates's message was transmitted across the Atlantic, the busy sea routes became even more chaotic than Dennis had feared. Blacked-out liners raced past each other in the fog. Miraculously, there were no collisions, and all of Cunard's ships made it safely to port. But Percy was not merely the director of a transatlantic steamship company anymore. He and the Cunard Line were now part of the greatest conflict the world had yet seen. Back in the 1850s, Samuel Cunard had lent his ships to the British government during the Crimean War. In the decades afterwards, the company received considerable support from the British Treasury. But that meant when fighting broke out in 1914, Percy Bates was also obligated to make Cunard ships available to the military again. But World War I would prove a far longer and bloodier conflict than the Crimean War. Over the next 4 years, the Cunard fleet sailed 3.5 million miles around the world, carried 9 million tons of supplies, and transported 900,000 troops. But that service came at a cost. 20 of the company's 25 ships were lost in combat. So when the war finally ended in 1918, a major rebuilding program was needed. Percy ordered the construction of 11 new ships, and the company's fleet was augmented by an enormous ocean liner confiscated from the defeated Germans. These new ships and a post-war economic boom reinvigorated the Cunard Line. So by 1926, its fleet was larger than it had been before the war. But competition on the North Atlantic was also fiercer than ever. The Germans had built new, fast liners. The Italian and French had plans to outdo them. And British pride demanded that Cunard now match that ambition. So in the late 1920s, plans were made for an 80,000-ton superliner, the grandest and most elegant ship the world had ever seen. Construction began in Glasgow in 1930. The ship was codenamed Hull 534. But then, events out of Percy's control derailed all his plans. The Great Depression devastated the world economy, and the shipping industry was not spared. Passenger numbers plunged, taking Cunard's revenues with them. And as the company slipped into the red, Percy made the difficult decision to suspend construction on Hull 534. Still, it wasn't enough. As the Depression continued to grind on, both Cunard and its old British rival, the White Star Line, were soon on the brink of collapse. With the shipyards of Glasgow silent and Cunard's superliner still unfinished, the future of the entire British shipping industry looked grim. That's when the government stepped in. Hoping to bolster the fragile national economy, politicians made Cunard an offer. The British state would loan the company £3 million to complete Hull 534, as well as an additional £5 million to construct an even bigger sister ship. In total, the bailout was almost the equivalent of $750 million today. Cunard had a lifeline, but once again, the help came with strings attached. The British government's assistance came with one condition: Cunard and White Star had to merge. Percy did not like the idea of joining forces with Cunard's bitter rivals, but he swallowed his pride as it was his only option. The new company was named Cunard White Star, with Cunard, the larger company, owning 2/3 of the operation. With the merger complete, the British government released the money and construction at the Glasgow shipping yard resumed. Finally, on May 27, 1936, the completed Hull 534, now named RMS Queen Mary, made her maiden voyage from Southampton, England to New York City. Many at the time called Queen Mary the grandest ocean liner ever built. Her black hull was over 1,000 feet long, and the top of her 3 iconic red smokestacks towered 180 feet above the sea. Her interiors were a testament to 1930s Art Deco design. Geometric patterns, bold lines, intricate wood paneling, and elegant furniture, all helping to create spaces that were both grand and inviting. Plus, RMS Queen Mary didn't just look good, she was immensely powerful. Cunard's new ocean liner could heave through the waves at speeds of more than 30 knots. That's about 35 miles per hour, almost 4 times as fast as the paddle steamers of Samuel Cunard's day. And then the Queen Mary was followed into the water only a few years later by her sister ship, the even larger Queen Elizabeth. And these 2 ships were intended to usher in a new business model for Cunard. The days of mass immigration to America were over, but companies like Cunard realized that income stream could be replaced by a new type of traveler, the middle-class tourist. As economies finally emerged from the Great Depression, there were growing numbers of would-be passengers with the money and desire to see more of the world. And of course, as they were tourists, these passengers were not heading to their destinations permanently. They needed to book a ticket home as well. Cunard now had the opportunity to charge them twice. But the new Queen Elizabeth's first passengers would not be tourists. They would be soldiers. World War II called both the Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth into military service as troop ships. But this time, Cunard's grand liners would survive the fighting, and both queens were able to return to service following the end of the war in 1945. Percy Bates died the following year, having successfully guided his company through not 1, but 2 world wars. And the prosperous decade that followed saw a new golden age for ocean liners on the North Atlantic. But in the late 1950s, Cunard would face a threat bigger than competition, war, or economic depression. A century earlier, Cunard had used steam engines to disrupt the shipping industry and render sailboats obsolete. Now it seemed another leap in technology was about to turn Cunard's grand ocean liners into relics of the past. It would fall to one man to save Cunard from sinking. But the mild-mannered accountant on a rescue mission would not come from within the company. Instead, he would come from the very industry that looked set to unravel Cunard's business model and destroy its hopes of prosperity, the airlines. From Wondery, this is episode 1 of Steering Cunard Off the Rocks for Business Movers. In the next episode, British airline accountant Basil Smallpiece becomes Cunard's newest chairman and is charged with saving the firm from collapse. It's summer 1964 in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, on board the Cunard liner RMS Queen Mary. Basil Smallpiece looks out over the choppy seas. The 57-year-old grips the railings with one hand and straightens his thick, round glasses with the other. Basil has recently been named to the Cunard board after a long career in the airline industry, and he's decided to make this transatlantic crossing to get a feel for his new employer. The journey is proving rougher than expected, though. So he tries to remain calm in front of the Cunard executive next to him, a stocky man in his 40s named Stanley. Stanley seems to be handling the weather with much greater ease. I say, "Are you all right, Basil?" "Oh, yes, quite all right. I rather thought summer would be a bit calmer, though." "Well, they do say the Atlantic has 2 moods, tempestuous and tyrannical." "It's even worse when she was first built, would you believe? She didn't have stabilizers then. Used to roll like a pig." The liner shudders as its prow bursts through another huge wave. A spray of salt water soaks Basil. "Ugh, you know what? I think I've seen enough of the deck for now. Let's go inside, shall we?" Stanley leads Basil through the door and into the ship's interior. And to Basil's delight, it's warm and dry. The two shed their coats and make their way down the hall into one of the ship's grand lounges. They take seats near a stage where a pianist plays jazz. "Well, Basil, leaving aside the tempestuous Atlantic, what do you think so far?" "Well, the staff are top-notch, of course, but I expected that. The cabins, though, I was pleasantly surprised by. You'd never know the ship is nearly 30 years old. The food is excellent. I'm just afraid I may have trouble keeping it down." "Well, you'll get your sea legs working here, that's for sure. Can we talk numbers?" Please, numbers are solid. I know where I am with numbers." Stanley produces a small notebook from his pocket and flips to a page in the middle. "Just to go over some broad industry figures, in 1957, 1 million passengers crossed the Atlantic by sea. Ships were still beating airplanes back then, if you can believe it. This year, though, the estimate is around 700,000. That's right, and falling fast. You only need to look around this lounge to see that. Empty tables, idle staff. Yes, jet planes are winning, I'm well aware. I'm partially responsible for that problem. Well, so, on to more Cunard-specific numbers, and if you weren't off your lunch already, you soon will be, because currently our annual losses on the passenger business sit at about £3 million a year." Basil's eyes widen. The losses would be equivalent to nearly $84 million today. Stanley quickly tries to cushion these appalling figures. But the cargo side is more positive. It's growing for one thing. It now represents 60% of our business. And what are the profits there? Estimated £2 million this year. So not enough to make up for the losses then. No. The ship lurches again. Basil feels sweat begin to bead on his forehead and a growing sense of nausea. He needs to excuse himself, so he gets unsteadily to his feet. Well, Stanley, thanks for the chat and the tour. Let's resume this later. Of course. Are you sure you're all right? You look a little green around the gills. I'll see you at dinner. Basil extends a clammy hand and Stanley shakes it. It won't always be this rough. You mean the sea or our finances? Well, both, I hope, now that you're here. Basil Smallpiece couldn't help but fear that saving Cunard's business might be a hopeless endeavor. His experience aboard the Queen Mary made him doubt that many people would ever choose to travel by sea when faster and more comfortable planes were available. But Basil wasn't one to give up easily. Cunard's old business model might be failing, but as far as Basil was concerned, that just meant it had to find a new one. From Wondery, I'm Lindsey Graham, and this is Business Movers. Before his death in 1865, company founder Samuel Cunard lived long enough to see his shipping firm transform trade on the North Atlantic. By embracing the new technology of steam engines, Samuel established a regular mail service across the ocean that more than doubled the speed of communication between Britain and North America. And his ships did not just transport the mail, they carried passengers as well. Samuel soon had competition from other shipping companies eager to meet the growing demand for transatlantic travel. But Samuel's first mover advantage and his close ties to the British government ensured that Cunard maintained its dominant position in the market. It was a position that the company held onto for decades after Samuel's death. The Cunard Line survived 2 world wars and an economic depression. And over the years, the firm's ships grew larger, more comfortable, and much faster. By the early 1950s, an Atlantic crossing could take just 3.5 days. At the same time, though, a new technological threat was beginning to emerge. There were already propeller planes that could cross the ocean faster than a steamship, but an even more advanced type of passenger aircraft was coming, one which would herald a new age of transport in the skies. For over 100 years, Cunard had reaped the benefits of being at the cutting edge of technology. Now, though, they were the ones whose comfortable business model was about to be disrupted. And it was an accountant named Basil Smallpiece who would eventually take on the challenge of correcting Cunard's course. But over a decade before Basil took the helm, he would first play a critical role in ushering in the very thing that threatened to kill off Cunard, the era of jet airliners. This is the second episode in our 4-part series on Cunard, containing the Comet. It's May 2nd, 1952 at London Heathrow Airport, 12 years before Basil Smallpiece's journey on the Queen Mary. From a crowded observation point, Basil looks across the asphalt at an impressive silver airplane getting ready for takeoff. The British-built Comet is about to make history as the world's first commercial jet airplane. 45-year-old Basil is the financial controller of the plane's owner, the British Overseas Airways Corporation. He was instrumental in convincing his colleagues at BOAC to purchase the Comet. Now Basil watches nervously as the aircraft prepares for its inaugural flight with paying passengers on board. Sitting beside Basil among the crowd of well-wishers and company officials is another BOAC accountant named William. Basil, I'm not sure I've ever seen you nervous before. Well, if this plane has to land early or turn around or, God forbid, fails for any other reason, you think we'll get the details today as to why? I want to be as transparent with the press as possible. You're already preparing a speech in case it crashes? Oh no, that's been prepared for weeks. I'm just wondering if the engineers will be able to diagnose a problem straight away. Basil, I worry about you sometimes. Oh, why's that? Thinking of every possible scenario the way you do, I don't think it's healthy. It's simply good accounting. This is not accounting. This is history, Basil. A celebration. Why don't you relax and enjoy the moment? Basil turns his gaze from the plane to William, smiling. He removes his glasses and wipes them on a handkerchief produced from his pocket. Then he stretches his neck and shoulders and looks at William again. There. Happy? Well, you fake a sense of ease with the best of them, I'll say that. The Comet is a marvelous machine. She'll be fine. And when she proves that, I'll throw out my script for the press conference. All heads snap in the direction of the plane as the engines fire. The Comet taxis briefly before making a right turn, pausing, and then speeding down the runway. Basil doesn't show it, but his heart beats nearly out of his chest. Then the plane lifts off and soars into the air, and the crowd cheers. As the plane grows tiny against the blue sky, a sense of relief permeates everyone around except Basil. William is the only one who notices. Well, we're off. Can't you be happy now? Tear up that script? I'll be happy when the thing lands. Until then, I'm keeping hold of the script. A little less than 24 hours later, Basil Smallpiece could finally relax. BOAC's Comet landed safely in Johannesburg, South Africa. The age of jet travel had officially begun. But Basil would soon learn a hard lesson, that technological revolutions were not always without victims. The Comet may have been faster than any other passenger plane in the sky, but it was not invulnerable. Basil Smallpiece had started at the British Overseas Airway Corporation, BOAC, in 1950, 2 years before the first commercial flight of the Comet. The nationalized company was then transitioning from providing air transport services for the British government to operating as a commercial passenger enterprise. One of Basil's first tasks as controller was to carve out a path for achieving the company's long-term goal, to end BOAC's reliance on government grants and financial support. To determine the financial lay of the land, Basil needed to find the company's break-even point where costs equaled revenues. But BOAC didn't have the accounting tools that Basil was used to from his previous jobs. Prior to Basil's arrival, BOAC had few ways of measuring its financial performance. So Basil decided the best way to correct this was by using a figure called passenger load factor. This was the percentage of aircraft seats on any flight which BOAC needed to sell to avoid a loss. Basil worked out that BOAC's high operating costs meant that it needed to sell 3 out of every 4 seats to break even. But BOAC barely sold 60% of its available tickets. Basil knew that he would need to reduce BOAC's costs so that the break-even point decreased to below 60%. But it was also clear to him that cost-cutting could only go so far. To make a reliable profit, the company also needed to increase its ticket sales. That, however, would be difficult with the company's existing fleet of aircraft. At the time, many BOAC flights were made using Boeing Stratocruisers, an aircraft derived from military planes, powered by 4 noisy and unreliable propeller engines and expensive to operate. A flight from London to New York on a Stratocruiser took about 15 hours, with a 1-hour stop in Newfoundland for refueling and a crew change. This was much faster than a trip on an ocean liner. But tickets on a Stratocruiser were far more expensive for a ride that was often bumpy and noisy. Most travelers still preferred the comfort, elegance, and reliability of ocean liners. So Basil feared there wouldn't be much ability for increasing ticket sales on the Stratocruisers. What BOAC really needed was new planes. And luckily for Basil, the British manufacturer de Havilland had an aircraft under development which seemed to be just what was needed. The Comet was the first passenger plane designed to use jet engines, and its top speed would be 526 miles per hour, considerably higher than the 350 miles per hour that Boeing's Stratocruiser could achieve. The Comet would also fly higher, which meant it would soar above the weather and provide its passengers with a far smoother and quieter ride. So for Basil, it was obvious that BOAC needed to be an early adopter of this new technology. He was sure that jet airliners would grab the public's attention and that whatever company would be the first mover would reap the benefits. If BOAC didn't embrace this new jet age quickly, others would get there first. And then Basil's company would be left with outdated aircraft, ever-increasing maintenance costs, and ever-decreasing passenger numbers. So Basil was delighted when BOAC confirmed its order for the new Comets. Still, he was a worrier by nature, and when Basil witnessed the takeoff of the first commercial Comet flight in May 1952, he struggled to shake off his feelings of dread. That sense of foreboding would be proved correct. In March of 1953, a Comet airplane transporting cargo for Canadian Pacific Airlines stalled shortly after takeoff, resulting in a crash that killed 11 crew members. Even worse news came in May, exactly 1 year after the first commercial Comet flight. A BOAC-operated Comet departing from India crashed 6 minutes after takeoff, killing all 43 people on board. Then, on January 10, 1954, another BOAC Comet exploded in midair, resulting in the deaths of all 35 passengers. These accidents horrified Basil. BOAC was forced to immediately withdraw all Comets from service. Modifications were made, and the planes returned to the skies in March of 1954. But just 1 month later, another Comet flown by BOAC again exploded in midair, killing all of its passengers. After that, the Comets were withdrawn indefinitely. It would later be determined that the cause of these accidents was metal fatigue caused by the rapid changes in pressure and temperature during the Comet's high-altitude flights. So now the once exciting jet planes were grounded and useless to BOAC. In June 1954, Basil was promoted to Deputy Chief Executive, making him all the more responsible for dealing with the crisis. And if BOAC was going to survive, the airline needed to restore its reputation and find new planes. At first, Basil patched up BOAC's fleet with propeller aircraft. He took no joy in what he saw as a step backward, but the company had to keep flying somehow. And while Basil debated with his team what to do next, word came from aircraft manufacturer de Havilland that a new iteration of their jet plane, the Comet 4, would be ready by 1958. De Havilland was confident that this new model would address the fatal flaws of earlier versions. But this news left Basil and the other BOAC executives with a decision to make. There was every chance that the Comet brand was now so toxic that the people would shun the aircraft no matter what improvements were made. But there was also considerable pressure on Basil from the British government to support British industry and buy British planes. BOAC was still owned by the state, so ultimately, Basil and his colleagues felt they had little choice. They caved into the demands of the politicians and put their faith in de Havilland to fix the Comet. Fortunately, when Basil accepted the deliveries of the Comet 4s in 1958, he found the new planes much improved. BOAC was able to offer the first scheduled commercial jet flights between London and New York. And despite Basil's fears about the reputation of the Comets, passengers flocked to BOAC, lured by the quicker trips offered by the new planes. And these new Comets finally delivered the results Basil wanted. In 1959, BOAC's fleet of 10 jet planes sold 74% of their seats, a total of 94,000 passengers, and well above the company's break-even point. The planes were profitable. But far more people were still choosing to cross the Atlantic the old-fashioned way, by sea. But Basil knew change was literally in the air, and was confident that once the safety and convenience of the new technology was accepted by the public, then jet airliners would soon supplant the ocean liners of old. By now, Basil had been made managing director of BOAC, and he didn't want to take any more chances. The failures of the previous Comet model still lingered in the back of his mind, and he was cautious about pinning all of BOAC's prospects on a plane with such a checkered past. So to hedge his bet on the Comets, Basil also began purchasing American Boeing 707 jets. This did not please the British government. Politicians wanted BOAC to buy more British planes instead, such as the Vickers VC-10. But Basil pointed out that they had already placed an order for VC-10s, but the government wasn't satisfied with that and made the company purchase even more. Basil was furious. He completely disagreed with the government's decision. The additional VC-10s would not be ready for 6 years, but BOAC would still be expected to front the cost of their construction. Basil feared the order for additional aircraft would place a dangerous strain on the company's finances. And he was right. The bumper profits of 1959 proved ephemeral. An economic recession cut demand for airline travel. And the drop in ticket sales, combined with the investment BOAC had made in new planes, resulted in huge losses for the company. And worse news was to follow. The construction of the extra VC-10s proved even more costly than predicted. Because it was the British government that had insisted on BOAC purchasing the planes, Basil felt that he should be able to write off the debt incurred as a result, but the government wouldn't allow that. This led to a bitter dispute between Basil and his political masters. Finally, in December of 1963, Basil felt he had no choice but to resign. He was enraged and deeply hurt that his 14-year adventure in aviation was coming to an end in this way. But just as quickly as Basil was forced to leave BOAC, he would be offered a new opportunity. By championing the jet airliner, Basil had sown the seeds of destruction for the ocean liner industry. Now, though, he would get a chance to save it. It's December 1963 in the center of London, 11 years after the first commercial flight of a BOAC Comet. The now 57-year-old Basil Smallpiece lingers in the cold mist and lights a cigarette. He's just wrapped up a board meeting at BOAC, Basil's last. A dispute with the government owners of the airline has led to Basil's resignation. And now, before he heads to the train station, Basil takes a moment to reflect. But after just a few drags of his cigarette, his reverie is interrupted by a voice from behind. "Basil?" Basil turns to see Sir John Brocklebank, the 48-year-old chairman of the Cunard Line. John is almost a decade younger than Basil, but he looks at least Basil's age, if not older. The two men shake hands. "John, this is unexpected?" "Not as unexpected as your news, Basil, leaving BOAC." "I know. Can you believe it? Having grown sadly familiar with our government, yes, I can. Where are you headed?" "Right now, Victoria." "Oh, me too. Let's share a cab." Before Basil can say no, John has raised his hand to hail a car. A gleaming black London taxi swoops in out of the mist, and the two businessmen clamber inside. John leans forward to tell the driver where to take them. "Victoria Station, please." Thank you, sir. This John?" "Not at all. What happened to you is terribly unfortunate. They don't know what they're losing." "That is awfully kind of you. Where will you go now? Do you know? We can't have you just sitting on the sidelines." I've nothing lined up, no." "Say, is Victoria really your station? I thought you lived north." "Oh, you've caught me. Well, I'll confess, I did not come by your office just to wish you luck. I came to offer you a job." "A job, John? The corpse of my last one is still warm." "I know, but I had to get to you before someone else did. I want you to come over to Cunard, join our board. We haven't had a true financial mind at the company in decades, and we've never needed one more." Basil sighs, but John presses on. "You're reluctant, I can tell." "I'm not reluctant. I'm honored. I'm humbled." "Don't say no yet, Basil. But most of all, I'm tired." "I understand that, but think what a challenge this would be, though, to help rescue a sinking ship. Sorry for the metaphor, but it's too perfect." "It's a very kind offer, John, but I've decided to go away for a few months, recharge my batteries. You understand. I'll certainly think about it, though." "Well, please do. And you know, I wasn't a bad cricketer when I was young. I was even selected for England once. Winter Tour of India, 39. But then Hitler decided to invade Poland, and, well, that was that. No time for cricket. I never got the call again. My point here is that in life one never quite knows when opportunity will come or go. We can wait for you, Basil, while you recharge those batteries. Just don't leave it too long." Then John leans forward. "You can drop me off here, driver." John turns back to Basil. "Now you shall give me an answer when you get back." "I promise." The taxi slows to a stop, and as John opens the door, a blast of cold air rushes into the taxi. Ugh, this weather. Where are you going, by the way, Basil? Somewhere a little warmer, I hope. Hong Kong. Oh, marvelous. Will you be flying BOAC? You're funny. Absolutely not. When Basil Smallpiece returned home from his vacation in early 1964, he felt rested and ready for a new challenge. He arranged to meet with Sir John Brocklebank and accepted the offer to join Cunard's board of directors. But even though Basil had some idea what to expect at the shipping company, the mess he was about to discover would be even worse than he imagined. The appointment of Basil Smallpiece was not the first time Cunard had tried to secure its future by looking to the airline industry. By the late 1950s, the threat posed by jet passenger planes had become impossible to ignore. Cunard decided that the best way to respond to this disruptive new technology was to diversify and make a bold move out of its traditional shipping business. So in March 1960, Cunard announced it was buying a controlling stake in British Eagle, a small independent airline. It was an expensive gamble, and the newly formed Cunard Eagle Airways was not kindly looked upon by its competitors in the aviation industry. They successfully lobbied the British government to refuse Eagle a license to operate on the lucrative London to New York route. This was a devastating blow for Cunard. With passenger numbers on its ocean liners already plummeting, the company now stood to lose millions of pounds on its new airline venture as well. The British government, though, did not want the embarrassment of the famous Cunard company collapsing on its watch. So a deal was brokered. The British Overseas Airway Corporation would join forces with Cunard's airline division. A new company would be formed named BOAC Cunard. The new arrangement meant Cunard would be less exposed to financial danger, but BOAC would become the dominant partner. Effectively, the deal offered Cunard a path out of the airline business, and they took it. Basil Smallpiece knew all about Cunard's ill-fated attempt at diversification. He had been the managing director at BOAC when the deal with Cunard went through. That meant, however, that when Basil joined Cunard in the spring of 1964, he found the company once again almost entirely focused on its traditional business. At first, Basil was just a director on Cunard's board with no management responsibilities. He spent his early months at the company familiarizing himself with the shipping industry and analyzing Cunard's prospects. But then, in November 1965, Basil's role changed dramatically. Cunard's chairman and chief executive, Sir John Brocklebank, stepped down due to poor health. Cunard's board voted for Basil to fill the position. And suddenly, Basil found himself running the Cunard Line, and he would have his work cut out for him. Cunard was struggling badly. Over the previous 3 years, its passenger business had lost £16 million, the equivalent of over $250 million today. The company had begun selling off assets to survive, and there was little sign of any recovery on the horizon. The losses were most acute aboard the company's two sister flagships, Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth. The grand red, white, and black ocean liners were expensive to operate. That wasn't such a problem when the luxury suites and cabins on board were selling out. But now, though, it was common for the liners to cross the Atlantic with more crew than passengers. There was a solution in the works at Cunard, though, a new ship codenamed Q4. The Q4 would have a higher passenger capacity, but would be lighter and cheaper to operate than the two Queens that preceded it. Its sleek design would be capable of both crossing the hazardous North Atlantic and making shorter cruises with more frequent stops. The hope at Cunard was that this dual-purpose ship would attract a broad customer base and turn a profit all year round. But the Q4 was years away from completion. Basil had to find a faster way to improve Cunard's bottom line. And like the shrewd accountant he was, Basil decided to focus first on reducing costs. It wasn't just a fleet of aging liners that was driving Cunard into the red. Little at the company's offices had changed in decades. The placid atmosphere reminded Basil more of an old-fashioned bank than a modern transportation company. Everywhere he looked, he saw opportunities to make savings and efficiencies. To implement these changes, Basil knew he would need a driven and capable management team. But Cunard's upper echelons were dominated by older men who had risen through the ranks simply through seniority. Most had little interest in shaking things up the way Basil thought necessary. Fortunately, though, Basil had an almost immediate opportunity to change this dynamic. Cunard's general manager was retiring, and Basil could replace him with a man of his choosing. His pick was Philip Bates. Philip was the nephew of former Cunard chairman Sir Percy Bates and knew the shipping company better than anyone. He was also only 40 years old and had the energy and modern perspective Basil was after. Basil thought he would be willing to take on the job of reforming Cunard's passenger business, and he was right. But Basil didn't just focus on management personnel. It wasn't only a question of who did the work, but where they did it mattered as well. Cunard had long been based in Liverpool, on the northwest coast of England. 600 Cunard staff lived and worked in the city, and all major decisions were made in the company's magnificent offices there. This location had been perfect when Liverpool's docks were the busiest in the world. In more recent years, though, Liverpool had been eclipsed by other ports. Most of Cunard's passenger ships now operated from Southampton, which was on the south coast of England, closer to London and the European continent. But this meant that the Cunard's upper management in Liverpool hardly ever even saw the company's ships. Basil felt this was absurd. The offices of a shipping company should be where the ships were. A relocation was long overdue. Basil knew it would be painful, though. He offered financial assistance for those willing to follow the company south from Liverpool and a compensation package for those who were unable to move. But there were some inevitable layoffs. Basil hated it, but the long-term health of the company was more important. If Cunard collapsed, far more people would be losing their jobs. So with his first major operational decisions made, Basil turned his attention from Cunard's passenger business to the cargo side of things. In the early 20th century, Cunard had acquired two subsidiaries, Port Line and the Brocklebank Line. Port Line specialized in shipping cargo between Britain and Australia. Brocklebank predominantly served the east coast of India. Brocklebank had a capable management team, and in 1965, the company had turned a small profit. So Basil was content not to interfere with operations there for the time being. Port Line was a different story. When Basil dove into the numbers, he found that the company's profits were slipping. This was especially troubling because for much of the early 1960s, Port Line had been Cunard's only profitable division. Clearly, it needed special attention. A typical round trip to Australia took over 160 days. But Basil was astonished to find that only 66% of those days were spent at sea. The rest of the time, Port Line ships were tied up in ports, loading and unloading and dealing with customs paperwork. In Basil's mind, a ship was no different to an aircraft or a freight train. If it wasn't moving, it wasn't earning. But it wasn't just time the Port Line was wasting, it was space as well. Basil discovered that a high proportion of cargo space on every voyage was going empty. The company was essentially moving large quantities of air from one country to another at a vast expense. Part of the problem was that the Port Line employed little standardization. Different ships were different sizes with different cargo configurations. It meant that consignments that would snugly fit in one Port Line ship would be an awkward squeeze on another. Ships were not easily interchangeable either, so in the event of damage or mechanical issues, Port Line had to keep a wide variety of spare vessels on hand. Like much of Cunard's operation, it was an inefficient and expensive way to run a business. Basil had to find a solution. But at first, he was stymied. He knew even less about cargo shipping than he did about the passenger trade. But then in early 1966, Basil took a trip to the United States. There he would discover that while one new technology was threatening to destroy Cunard, there was another that could provide it with a lifeline. It's spring 1966 in Port Newark, New Jersey. At the water's edge, Basil Smallpiece follows behind Malcolm McLean, a 54-year-old American trucking magnate. Malcolm is giving Basil a tour of a new type of dock made for a new type of cargo vessel, the container ship. Malcolm points to a large, red, industrial-looking ship making its way out of the port, its upper decks laden with hundreds of identical metal containers. Now that was an old oil tanker we bought and converted. Eventually, we'll replace her with a custom-built container ship, but she's working just fine for now. And to tell you the truth, the ships themselves are not that important. What do you mean by that? Malcolm turns around and points at the huge asphalt parking lot next to the dock. No, that's the key to containerization. That's where the real magic happens. The lot behind them is lined with row after row of identical metal containers just like the ones on the ship. Between them are small roads that allow the containers to be moved on wheels. The containers move from ships via crane onto a flatboard transport truck, then into the lot. And when they're ready to move inland, they're loaded onto the back of a semi-truck. Process works in reverse as well. Basil is impressed. He analyzes out loud to Malcolm. Everyone else has been obsessed with decreasing manual labor costs, but that's not really where the money is lost, is it? The brilliance of what you're doing here is that in the ship's turnaround time. That's right. A ship in port is a ship losing money. Couldn't have put it better myself. Basil nods out at the red container ship maneuvering towards the ocean. And how fast can you turn one of those around? 16 hours. You're kidding. Nope. And you can probably work out what that does to our costs. When I started this, loading cargo by hand the old-fashioned way cost more than $5 a ton. These methods brought that down to just over a dime. Oh goodness, our cargo ships spend days in port. I can't even begin to tell you how much it costs. Basil slowly rotates on his feet, taking in the full scale of the container terminal. He's sold on the concept. Well, I don't suppose you'd want to consult for my company, help out the competition? I wouldn't have met you here if I was afraid of competition, because look, Basil, this whole thing only takes off if it becomes the new standard. The reality is, I need container terminals all around the world. I need Cunard on board, and everyone else for that matter. So you go back to England, spread the word. I will certainly do that, Mr. McLean. Well, what else can I say? Where do I sign us up? Basil Smallpiece returned to London certain that he had just witnessed the next great advance in shipping technology. In fact, he thought it could be as important as when the steam engine replaced sails in the 19th century. Basil was convinced that Cunard had to containerize as soon as possible. It would slash their costs and potentially save the business. But he also knew that converting to this new way of handling cargo would be a long and complicated process. If Cunard was to embrace this new methodology, it would need help. Basil Smallpiece was not the first business leader in the British shipping industry to see the potential in container ships. A year before Basil's visit to New Jersey, Cunard's longtime rival P&O and 3 other British shipping companies had come together to form a new conglomerate named Overseas Containers Limited. They had a head start on Cunard, and Basil thought it would be tough to compete against their combined forces. So Basil decided that the best way forward was for Cunard to join the new collective as well. Basil met privately with leaders of the shipping company P&O to see if there was a way for Cunard to get a slice of the pie. But P&O flatly denied Basil's request. The 4 companies that formed Overseas Containers Limited were determined to crowd out the competition, and they knew Cunard was struggling and had no intention of offering their rival a helping hand. Basil was disappointed, but he refused to sit idly by. He was still dead set on joining the container ship revolution, so he decided to form a conglomerate of his own. He approached 3 other smaller British shipping companies, and together with Cunard, they became Associated Container Transportation, or ACT. The upfront costs of containerization would be considerable, though. New ships would need to be bought or constructed, and specialized docks would have to be built like the one Basil saw in New Jersey. Even with the combined resources of 4 companies, it would take years for the conglomerate to see the benefits. But Basil was certain containerization would pay off. He just had to make sure Cunard was still around when it did. By this time, Basil was just 6 months into his tenure as chairman and chief executive. In that short time, he had slashed costs and overhauled Cunard's management. The company's new flagship, the Q4, was rising above the stocks at the shipyard in Glasgow, and the long-deferred office move from Liverpool to Southampton was finally underway. But despite all Basil's efforts, the fundamentals hadn't changed. Air travel was still growing, and Cunard was still losing money. Basil knew that there was no hope for the company in merely tweaking its old business model. The golden age of ocean liners had passed and was not coming back. Since the emergence of jet passenger plane, there was no way to find profit in running a year-round service on the North Atlantic anymore. Cunard had to adapt or die. And Basil believed that if containerization was the future of the company's cargo operations, then leisure travel was the future of its passenger business. Cruise ships had once been the poor relation of the mighty ocean liner. Now they might be Cunard's best chance at survival. The Q4 was being built with cruising in mind, but a wider overhaul of the company's passenger ships was needed. The Cunard fleet was still dominated by old ocean liners like the Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth. These ships were iconic and beloved, but Basil knew they had to go. Despite all the challenges facing Cunard, Basil still believed he could see a course to safety for the ailing shipping firm. He had his strategy in place and hoped to turn the company's fortunes around within the next 3 years. But in May 1966, an unexpected setback would upend Basil's plans and puncture his fragile sense of optimism. A national strike by ship workers in the United Kingdom would shake the entire industry, and this walkout would trap Basil's fleet in port, costing his company millions of pounds and leaving Cunard hanging on by a thread. From Wondery, this is episode 2 of Steering Cunard Off the Rocks for Business Movers. In the next episode, Basil Smallpiece and Cunard face a strike so devastating that the British government declares a state of emergency. It's November 10th, 1966, backstage at the Royal Albert Hall in London, England. Cunard's chairman, Basil Smallpiece, dabs the sweat off his forehead with a handkerchief. He's about to give a speech to the Institute of Directors on the changes he's making at Cunard and the lessons his experience can offer the rest of Britain. More than 4,000 business leaders are packed into the hall waiting for him. They're listening to another speaker right now, but he's wrapping up, and Basil is due on stage next and growing nervous. Glancing at his notes, he mutters some lines from his speech, rehearsing. In this country, we seem to lack the stamina to cap a good beginning. To cap a good beginning and see things through. We seem to lack guts. We seem to be missing the resource and the courage to adapt ourselves to the modern world. Sounds serious. Basil turns to see his wife, Kay. Oh, don't poke fun. Kay smiles at him reassuringly and straightens out his tie. She can tell he's nervous. You've rehearsed as much as I've seen anyone rehearse anything. You could give that speech in your sleep by now. I think I could too. Oh, I just don't belong on stage. I'm an accountant. We're not exactly known for our oratory excellence. Basil, you haven't been an accountant in decades. You're a leader, and you belong out there. Oh, I don't know about that. I'm still worried about this opening line. Why are you smiling? I'm not. You are. It's just funny to see you so worked up. I hardly ever get to see it. So, all right, go on. I'm listening. Okay. One of the basic features of Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection is adaptability. Animals that don't adapt become extinct. The same goes for human institutions. The higher the development of the institution, the greater the need to modify. What do you think? Basil looks at Kay. Well, that was 4 lines. Fine, but how was it? Terribly boring. I'm sure they'll love it. Can I do a little more for you? No, they'll want you on stage any moment, darling. I'm just struggling with this opener. In the dawn of new experience and the sunshine of spectacular success. This is Cunard's day of reckoning. We must adapt or go under. Go under? But when Basil looks at his wife, Kay seems proud. You know, you don't give yourself enough credit. It was all right then? Yes, it was all right. I think that's your cue. I suppose it must be. Break a leg, darling. And remember, breathe and slow down. Basil Smallpiece's speech to the Institute of Directors made newspaper headlines all across the country. It was a damning criticism of Britain in the 1960s and a rallying call for action. He said the country had not found its place in the world following the loss of its empire and that it would have to change to survive. The speech was well received. And after all his practice, Basil appeared confident in front of his colleagues. Underneath his cool exterior, though, he wondered if he would truly be able to save Cunard, or if his company was doomed to go the way of the British Empire and become just another relic of the past. From Wonder Eve, I'm Lindsey Graham, and this is Business Movers. When Basil Smallpiece received the offer to join the struggling Cunard Line in 1964, he was still reeling from his forced resignation as chief executive at the British Overseas Airways Corporation. But after a brief sabbatical, Basil found that he couldn't resist the challenge that Cunard represented. It was almost poetic. At the British Overseas Airway Corporation, or BOAC, Basil had helped introduce the passenger jets that had supplanted ocean liners and seemingly doomed companies like Cunard. Now Basil was tasked with taming the monster he'd helped create. For more than a century, Cunard had made most of its profits ferrying people back and forth between Britain and North America by sea. But by the 1960s, that part of the business was hemorrhaging money. Basil knew that the company couldn't go on offering its year-round service on the North Atlantic. There just wasn't enough demand. But Basil still believed Cunard had another attractive product it could sell: leisure travel. He hoped that the company's new ship, codenamed Q4, would help Cunard transition from the traditional transatlantic routes to shorter cruises and warmer waters. But it wasn't only Cunard's passenger business that Basil planned to modernize. Cunard operated 2 main cargo subsidiaries, the Port Line, serving Australia, and the Brocklebank Line, serving India. But both were only marginally profitable, however, and plagued by logistical issues. Basil hoped a new approach to shipping would solve both of those problems. Containerization promised to slash Cunard's costs by radically streamlining the loading and unloading of cargo. Embracing this new method would be expensive, though. So Basil joined forces with 3 other small shipping companies to establish the Associated Container Transportation Consortium, or ACT. The pooled resources of the ACT would ease the strain on Cunard's fragile finances, but the transition to container ships would still take several years, as would the construction of the leisure ship Q4. Basil thought he just had to keep the company's head above water until his reforms and initiatives finally paid off. But in the middle of 1966, a new and unexpected crisis would emerge, one which would threaten to undo all of Basil's hard work. Cunard's staff would stop working, their ships would stop sailing, and Basil's hopes would start sinking. This is the 3rd episode in our 4-part series on Cunard, the New Queen. It's May 16, 1966, at a dock in Liverpool, England, 6 months before Basil Smallpiece's speech at the Royal Albert Hall. Basil looks around, addressing the situation. He's come here on one of his regular visits to the Cunard cargo operation in Liverpool, but the entire dock is deserted. The National Union of Seamen has just announced a strike, and most of Cunard's employees have answered the call to the picket line. Basil hears a sign of life behind him and turns to see one worker who's come to collect some belongings. When the man catches sight of Basil, though, he looks away nervously, picking up his pace. Basil calls after him.
Excuse me, do you have a moment?
The worker stops and turns reluctantly. Basil catches up with him. Are you one of the striking workers? You're management, aren't you? I'm really not supposed to speak with you. What's that? I'll have to be carrying on. Wait, just a moment. They'll tear up my membership card. We're to have no contact with management of any company. Well, I'm not just management, I'm the chairman. The other man's eyes widen. Then I definitely shouldn't be speaking with you. Good day, sir. No, stay. I just want to know what's going on. What's the feeling among the workers? You suppose the strike will last a long time? The worker glances around nervously. Basil tries to reassure him. Look, there's no one else here. Just a few seagulls. They're not going to tell a soul. Neither will I. The man gives a pained expression, but then finally speaks. Well, there are some strong feelings about this, sir. I can imagine. We get paid £14 a week. You know that? For 56 hours. It's not right. Well, I do appreciate what you do for Cunard, but surely if your union leaders get round the table with the right attitude, we can sort all of this out. The man bristles. Well, maybe it's your representatives at the Shipping Federation who need to sort out their attitude. Basil immediately realizes he's taken the wrong approach and softens his tone. Well, sadly, I have little influence there. You know, I worked in airlines before this, and we dealt directly with our unions. Now, there's nothing I can do. Legally, I have to hand all responsibility over to the Federation. They're the ones who can negotiate with your officials. So you're not meant to be talking with me either. No, I suppose I'm not. I'll have to rely on your discretion, too. The 2 men look at each other for a moment. Then quietly, the worker says, Well, I'll tell you this, sir, and then I should go. The union is ready to ride this out. For how long? The man shrugs. Don't know. As long as it takes. Well, thank you for your time, and I won't detain you any further. And remember, I didn't see you, and you didn't see me. The man nods, raising the collar of his coat, and heads back toward the street. As he reaches the dock exit, though, he turns back. You said you worked in airlines?
Yeah, that's right.
Maybe you should ask for your old job back. A few hours after Basil Smallpiece's encounter with his employee, the dock came back to life, not with men ready to work, but with union members holding picket signs. Until this point, Basil had recognized the challenges facing Cunard, but he had still felt confident in his ability to turn things around. Now, though, he was cut off from his employees, and his ships were all floating idly at the dockside. Basil wondered if this strike meant that all his efforts to turn the company around would be wasted. He was used to taking action, to making a difference. But now there was nothing he could do but watch the losses mount. The National Union of Seamen had gone on strike after negotiations broke down with the Shipping Federation, the group representing Britain's shipowners. The dispute centered on working hours and pay. The workers received just 5 shillings an hour. That was almost 50% lower than the wage of the average manual labor at the time and the equivalent of a little over $7 per hour today, less than the current federal minimum wage. This strike affected the entire British shipping industry, and with it at a standstill, it wouldn't be long before the rest of the British economy ground to a halt as well. The government in London was deeply concerned. As an island nation, Britain was highly dependent on imports arriving by sea. Now, it was as if a foreign enemy had suddenly blockaded all its ports. By early June 1966, almost 700 ships were stuck in port and 20,000 seamen across the country on strike. The politicians tried to help the two sides in the dispute negotiate, but compromise proved elusive. Finally, the government declared a state of emergency, allowing it to deploy the military to load and unload ships if necessary. And this fatally undermined the union's bargaining position. After 6 weeks of protest, the accumulation of lost wages and the steadfastness of the government and shipping federation proved too much. On July 1, 1966, the union admitted defeat. There would be no increase in wages or reduction in hours. But the striking workers weren't the only ones to suffer. The shutdown caused massive losses for the shipping companies. And in total, the strike cost Cunard nearly £4 million, around $110 million today, pushing the year's total projected losses to around £6 million, leaving Basil Smallpiece worried that Cunard was about to go bankrupt. Other businesses might have been tempted to sugarcoat such dire figures. In the past, shipping companies have been especially reluctant to publicly share financial information. But Basil thought this was wrong. He knew that if he was to stand any chance of saving the company, he would need patience and support from Cunard's shareholders. The only way to get that, he believed, was through transparency and honesty. So while most of his staff were still on the picket lines, Basil sat down to write his first annual report as Cunard chairman. Basil decided to spell out exactly where Cunard's losses had come from and the costs and revenues of each arm of the company. The resulting 1966 Cunard financial report was unprecedented in the industry. In Basil's own words, he was far more frank than many other chairmen would have been. And the Daily Mail newspaper remarked that it may be well rated as the finest clinical appraisal of the shipping industry yet undertaken and put on record. The report was so remarkable that Basil was invited to speak about it to a national organization for business leaders called the Institute of Directors. The theme of Basil's speech in November 1966 was adaptability to change. And in Basil's opinion, it wasn't just his company, Cunard, that needed to evolve. He saw echoes of his firm's struggles up and down the country. Britain had relinquished its empire in the 1940s and 50s, but according to Basil, it was living above its means in the 1960s. In his eyes, the country had failed to adapt to modern times, and its struggling economy was proof of that. Prompt action was needed to turn things around, even if that meant some difficult decisions had to be made. And soon, Basil would be forced to practice what he preached. Earlier in the decade, before he joined the company, Cunard had entered into a partnership with Basil's former employer, the British Overseas Airways Corporation, or BOAC. This joint venture had been the result of Cunard trying to diversify out of its traditional businesses and grab a slice of the growing market for air travel. After some early troubles by 1966, BOAC Cunard was finally turning a profit. That year, BOAC asked Cunard to help finance the purchase of new aircraft. But with the shipping company struggling in the wake of the strike, Cunard just did not have the capital on hand. So Basil was left with a decision to make. It seemed to him that BOAC Cunard was a hangover from an earlier corporate strategy that was no longer relevant. Besides, the joint venture was run entirely by the other company and didn't even provide job opportunities for Cunard employees. And now, with Cunard no longer able to keep up its financial obligations, Basil looked for a permanent way out. In the fall of 1966, he struck a deal with BOAC to sell Cunard's interest in the joint venture for £11.5 million. This agreement meant that Cunard recovered its initial £8.5 million investment and made a £3 million profit on top. This windfall helped offset Cunard's 1966 losses, much needed oxygen for a drowning business. And with this cash infusion in the bank, Basil hoped Cunard could survive long enough for the next stage of his strategy to bear fruit. On the cargo side of the business, Basil was still pursuing containerization through his new conglomerate, the ACT. But while he waited on the long process of converting Cunard's ships and docks to this new system, Basil didn't want to sit on his hands. And in fact, he couldn't. Brocklebank, a Cunard cargo subsidiary, was in trouble. When Basil first took over at Cunard, Brocklebank had seemed in good health. It had turned a small profit, and Basil was impressed by its management team. But the world was shifting around Brocklebank as well. The bulk of its business was in shipping to and from South Asia. That had been a lucrative trade route when Britain had ruled India. But they had gained their independence in 1947, and ever since then, Brocklebank's long-term prospects had been in doubt. Now, increased competition was squeezing revenues even more. And with the cargo business smaller than it once was, Basil could see no reason to continue incurring the overhead of maintaining a separate management team for Brocklebank. So he consolidated operations with Cunard's main office, cutting costs and improving the bottom line. But if trade with India was failing, Basil spied an opportunity with another of Britain's former imperial possessions. Since 1914, Cunard's other cargo subsidiary, the Port Line, had been transporting cargo between Britain and Australia. Mostly, it had been British exports heading down under. But Australia was growing rapidly in the 1960s and beginning to produce large quantities of iron ore and other potentially valuable exports. Basil realized that Australia wouldn't want to rely on foreign shipping companies alone much longer. It would want Australian goods to be carried on Australian ships. Cunard, though, was a proudly British firm through and through. So somehow Basil Smallpiece would have to square that circle. Because if he didn't, Cunard would miss out on this lucrative emerging market and take yet one more step closer to disaster. It's February 1967 and Canberra, Australia, 7 months after the strike by British shipping workers. On the spacious terrace of an upscale restaurant, Basil Smallpiece watches as a waiter refills the wine glass of Australia's Secretary of Trade and Industry, 53-year-old Sir Alan Westerman. Basil has traveled down under on a delicate mission. He wants the Australian government to invest in Cunard's cargo arm, the Port Line. But he needs Alan on his side for this, and Alan knows it. Oh, you know what would be perfect after such a big steak? A nice cigar. You bring any cigars with you, Basil? No, I'm afraid not. Oh, too bad. I think I brought something rather more interesting, though. Ah, scotch. No, not whiskey either. You palms always dancing around what you have to say. Come on, let's hear it then. Well, I was told you don't care for British ship owners. And I can quite understand why. As a collective, we've worked to keep Australia out of the international deep-sea trade for years. That's right, you have. We've got some fine companies working up and down our coasts, but you lot have helped lock them out of anything more. Well, I think it's a very short-sighted way of looking at things. Australia's economy is growing. You're a global player now, and it's time you had a proper international shipping operation. It's true, but... see, yeah, always a but. But building up an international shipping company is hard work. It's far more complicated than just carrying goods within your own territory. And it's not simply a matter of buying the right ships. You have to find reliable crews and suppliers, make agreements with different ports and governments. I know there's red tape, Basil. Crikey, I work in government. Well, what if I told you that there was a way Australia could have its own shipping company without the hassle? All right, go on. I would like the Australian government to purchase a stake in Cunard's Port Line. Alan leans back in his chair, taking a moment to digest this pitch. It's an intriguing and unexpected offer. Oh, I'd have to consider the politics of that. These would still be British ships. No, there's a positive story here you can tell. This is Australia's time. You're not a colony anymore, dependent on the mother country sending supplies across the ocean. And what better way to show that than taking a stake in a British company as a partner, equal in esteem and standing? That'd be a boon to national pride, I should think. Yeah, but what's in it for Cunard, though? You're not suggesting this out of the goodness of your heart. Of course not. Obviously, we retain a substantial stake in the Port Line and take our share of its success. But with your local expertise, I'm certain the company can also expand more rapidly here. So you see, it's good for both of us. You get access to our international operation, and we get a bigger slice of the thriving Australian market. Alan sits in silence for a moment. Basil remains silent too, patiently sipping his wine. Finally, Alan tosses a napkin onto the table and looks Basil straight in the eye. Well, you know what, Basil, you're right. I don't like British ship owners, but maybe you're right about some other things as well. This is not a yes. It's a little early for wedding bells, but let's start the process and see where it leads us. Basil smiles and raises his glass. Well, to new partnerships then. to new partnerships. But Basil, have you ever considered a career in politics? Oh, only in my nightmares. There are enough sharks for me out at sea. Basil Smallpiece had made a promising start to negotiations with the Australian government, but his proposal would soon become bogged down in bureaucracy of its own and political wrangling both in Australia and Britain, forcing Basil once again into a position of being patient and hoping that his efforts would eventually pay off. In the meantime, though, Cunard's already shaky finances were about to take another hit. In the summer of 1967, Cunard's accounting department informed the company's chairman, Basil Smallpiece, that passenger numbers were again falling below forecast. The roughly 20% decline seemed to be part of a larger global recession in luxury goods and services. Cunard's accountants calculated that as a result, the company was projected to lose another £3.5 million on its passenger ships in 1967. Making matters worse, construction costs on Cunard's new liner, codenamed Q4, were rising as well. And this was bad news. Basil had pinned his hopes on this new dual-purpose ship. The Q4 would operate as a liner during the summer months, when there was still some demand from passengers wanting to cross the Atlantic the old-fashioned way. But in the winter, the new Cunard ship would chase the sun as a cruise vessel. Advances in engine technology would allow the Q4 to reach the same speeds as her predecessors while cutting fuel consumption by half. This was projected to save Cunard £1 million annually in fuel costs alone, and the Q4 was slightly smaller than her predecessors as well. That would allow the new ship to fit through the Panama Canal to reach the Pacific. Her shallower draft would also enable her to call at ports which the bigger, older liners simply couldn't enter. But all these improvements came at a cost. The Q4 had been forecast at a price of over £25 million, nearly $800 million today. This was far more than Cunard could afford, and the British government had stepped in with a loan to cover over 2/3 of the construction cost. But even that would no longer be enough. Basil's accountants informed him that the latest cost projections were coming in almost 15% higher than the original estimates. So just when Basil thought that profits in 1968 looked possible, this news changed everything. Basil's original plan had been to keep Cunard's most famous passenger liners in service until the new ship was finished. The Queen Mary was to retire in October 1968, and her sister ship, the Queen Elizabeth, would follow a year later. But the recent collapse in revenues meant that Cunard could no longer afford to keep the old ships in service for so long. The two vast liners were decades old, and their maintenance costs were only increasing. So Basil made the decision to retire both ships a year earlier than planned. It was a devastating announcement. Hundreds of Cunard staff were employed on the two Queens, and they had long known that there wouldn't be places for all of them on the new ship, which was smaller and more efficient. Half of them stood to lose their jobs, and now those layoffs would happen even sooner than expected. These impending job losses troubled Basil. To him, Cunard's impeccable staff had been a light in the darkness when it seemed the company had little else going for it. Their spirits had remained high despite all the difficulties of recent years, and their loyalty to the company had been admirable. Now Basil felt like he was betraying them, but he also knew he had little choice. To preserve morale, Basil stuck to the philosophy he used with his shareholders: transparency and honesty. He began publishing a newsletter to keep employees informed about the company's future and to explain his decisions to them. Among the first announcements he had to explain was his plan for the two retiring Queens. Many other great ocean liners were being sold off or scrapped at this time, and there was a great deal of public debate about how to give these ships a fitting farewell. One famous former liner, the Ile-de-France, was even used as a set for a Hollywood disaster film. Production saw the ship ripped apart, blown up and half sunk, causing outrage in France, where the liner had been iconic. Basil didn't want to cause a similar controversy, but he still felt that the best use of the Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth now was to sell them and raise funds for their successor. So in the summer of 1967, the first of the old ships went on sale. The auction of the RMS Queen Mary was a somber event. There were several bidders, but ultimately, the city of Long Beach, California won out with its offer of almost $3.5 million, the equivalent of $33 million today. Long Beach planned to use the Queen Mary as a floating tourist attraction and maritime museum, but the city insisted on there being a proper ceremonial handover. It wanted to welcome the ship to its new home in a blaze of glory. So the last voyage of the Queen Mary had to be a real one, with passengers lining the rails just as they had so many times before. For Basil and the Cunard team, though, this was a logistical nightmare. The Queen Mary was too large to fit through the Panama Canal, and this meant that in order to get to California from England, the ocean liner needed to sail all the way around the southern tip of South America. The 31-year-old Queen Mary was built for transatlantic crossings, a journey that took under a week. Her voyage around the notoriously stormy Cape Horn, however, was scheduled to take over a month. Basil and other Cunard leaders tried to warn the Long Beach representatives that the trip was not a good idea, but they wouldn't hear of it. They insisted on the arduous final voyage, and they got their way. Travel agents were soon marketing the trip as the last great cruise, and more than 1,000 passengers bought tickets. So the Queen Mary set off from Southampton on October 31st, 1967, to the tune of passengers singing Auld Lang Syne. But the festive atmosphere on board didn't last long. Gale-force winds between France and Spain buffeted the ship, causing many passengers to become seasick. Things only got worse as the ship crossed the equator. The Queen Mary had been designed for the cooler climate of the North Atlantic. In hot weather, her hull was like an oven. It was miserable for everyone on board, and the heat became so intense that one crew member died. So at every port the liner called at, more and more passengers abandoned the voyage. Only a fraction remained when the Queen Mary finally arrived in Long Beach in December 1967. But despite the difficult voyage, the old liner was welcomed with fanfare. An airplane bombarded her with flowers, and crowds of people cheered and wept as the ship made its way into the harbor where it is still moored today. Basil Smallpiece did not partake in any of the festivities. He had too much to do. Cunard's new liner, the Q4, was nearly ready for its launch and final fitting out. That meant it would soon be time for Basil to pay the shipbuilders. But when he crunched the numbers, he realized that Cunard was coming up short, even after selling the Queen Mary. This was a potential catastrophe. All of Basil's plans for the future of the company rested on the success of the Q4. The launch was just weeks away, and Queen Elizabeth II herself would be attending the ceremony. Basil had to find more money, but he was running out of time. It's August 1967, inside a government building in London, England, a month before the launch of Cunard's new liner, the Q4. Basil Smallpiece follows a secretary down to the end of an anonymous gray hallway. Their shoes squeak on the linoleum floor. It's a hot day, and even the walls seem to have a sheen of sweat on them.
Come.
Basil nods his thanks to the secretary, and then steps into a small and airless corner office. Tall government official named Peter Brummels unfolds himself from his chair and rises from the desk to shake Basil's hand. Mr. Smallpiece, would you care for a cup of tea? Oh, no, thank you. Yes, it is a little warm for it today, perhaps. It's these windows, you see. I think they're painted shut. But regardless, please, take a seat. The two men sit, and Peter continues. Now, you spoke of some urgency on the telephone. Yes, indeed. Considerable urgency, actually. I need our loan increased to $24 million, and I need the money expedited. Peter raises his eyebrows. Well, that is a fairly significant increase from the original amount, $17.6 million. Yes, I'm well aware. The recession has affected our passenger business, and the cost of our new ship has increased unexpectedly. Without this additional financing, construction on the Q4 will have to be stopped. Oh, I see. And the Cunard Line is unable to make up even a part of this shortfall? Not at this moment, no. I see. We are well on our way to profitability in the long run, especially on the cargo side. I can show you projections. I'll even take you to a container terminal if you'd like. And the Q4 is certainly going to boost the passenger side. I see. She really is a magnificent ship. Basil watches anxiously as Peter scribbles some notes. And finally, Peter looks up at Basil. Well, I shall pass this along. Do you know when I might hear an answer? It is most urgent, as I said. I'm sure we can expedite it. Why don't you come by next week for an update? Next week? Will that not work for you? I'm sure we can fit in the following week. No. I need the loan now. Mr. Smallpiece, we have to follow standard procedures. £7.5 million is no small sum of money. It will have to be next week at the very earliest before we know more. but I shall certainly pass on your concerns. We need these funds by the 14th of September, or this ship may never be finished. I understand that you have commercial priorities, but we can't be beholden to those. Well, if we don't receive that money, it will have obvious political repercussions. One would be amazed at how many executives say the same thing when they come here. Everyone's a special case, I find. With respect to most of the public, Cunard ships represent Britain itself. They're named after our queens, after all. If we're building new ships, the economy is strong. If construction has to be paused, the economy must be weak. Britain must be weak. To Basil's irritation, Peter's face betrays no emotion. He just smiles blandly. I see. Well, I shall certainly pass that along, yes, I know. Well, thank you for your help. Loan negotiations between Basil Smallpiece and the British government continued throughout the rest of August 1967. Each time Basil met with officials, he pressed upon them the urgency of the matter. And each time, the officials prevaricated. The days ticked by and the launch of the Q4 grew closer. And yet still, Basil did not have the money he needed. By September 13, 1967, the launch of the new Cunard ocean liner Q4 was just a week away. But no word on the loan extension was coming through official channels, so Basil Smallpiece decided it was time to cut through the red tape. He and some of his senior colleagues requested a private meeting with Harold Lever, Britain's financial secretary to the Treasury. Harold agreed to meet and invited the Cunard team to his home. At the meeting, Harold listened attentively as Basil laid out what was at stake. Basil emphasized yet again that if additional funding from the British government did not come through in time, Cunard would almost certainly have to reject delivery of the Q4 from the shipbuilders. Precisely what would happen then, even Basil couldn't say. But the publicity would certainly be appalling. Cunard shareholders would be horrified, and the entire future of the company would be in doubt. Hearing all this, Harold appeared sympathetic. He promised to consult his colleagues in government urgently and give Basil a definitive answer by the next day. Basil and the Cunard executives had to prepare for the worst, though. A board meeting was arranged for the following afternoon, and as they waited on word from Harold, they discussed what they might do should the government decline their request. After some debate, the board and Basil concluded that Cunard would likely have to liquidate its assets and shut down the company. After more than 125 years in business and having survived 2 world wars, this was the greatest crisis Cunard had ever known. Then, in the middle of this grim conversation, a letter arrived at Cunard's head office. It was from Harold Lever. He had negotiated with his colleagues in the Treasury and arranged for Cunard's loan to be increased from £17.6 million to £24 million. The Cunard men in the boardroom roared with relief as Basil read out the letter. The company was saved. With funding secured, the shipbuilders could be paid and the Q4 could be launched by the Queen on schedule. The new liner could then have its final internal fittings installed and be made ready for its maiden voyage. Advertising campaigns were already being prepared, and with anticipation growing among the public at the prospect of a new ship, there was hope after all that Cunard could once again achieve profits. Despite a damaging strike, slumping revenues, and the premature retirement of its most famous ship, the Cunard Line was still afloat. Basil's reforms had saved the company millions of pounds and staved off bankruptcy just long enough for the Q4 to come to the company's rescue. The ship was a sleek and striking mixture of old and new, with a traditional dark hull and white superstructure of a Cunard liner married with a swept-back prow more reminiscent of a luxury yacht. But the ship that was supposed to lead Cunard into a bright new future would soon risk dragging the company back into the problems of the past. As the date of Q4's planned maiden voyage neared, problems would emerge with Cunard's gleaming new flagship. Malfunctioning machinery and unfinished interiors would see the liner's debut delayed, and the ship which Basil Smallpiece had worked so hard to get afloat might soon be in danger of being dead in the water. From Wondery, this is episode 3 of Steering Cunard Off the Rocks for Business Movers. On the next episode, Queen Elizabeth II christens Cunard's grand new liner and delivers an unexpected surprise. Meanwhile, Basil Smallpiece must race against the clock in order to get the ship ready in time for the travel season. It's September 1967 at a shipyard on the River Clyde in Scotland. Cunard chairman Basil Smallpiece walks along a concrete path next to Sir Michael Adine, Queen Elizabeth II's private secretary. The hull of a massive red and black ship towers over the men. It's the Q4, Cunard's latest liner, nearing completion, and the Queen herself is due to christen the ship at a ceremony later in the month. But a name for the vessel has still not been selected. Two men stop beneath the ship's bow, and Michael tilts his head back to take in its size.
You know, Her Majesty is very much looking forward to the ceremony. She remembers her mother christening the old Queen Elizabeth back in 38. Have you chosen a name yet? There's one I have in mind, actually. Oh, good. We were beginning to get a little concerned. It is, perhaps unconventional, though. Oh? Well, if I were to have my way, I would christen her Queen Elizabeth II. And break tradition? Basil, how could you?
Michael is referring to the British custom that only battleships in time of war can be named after reigning monarchs.
Well, what other name could be worthy of Cunard's most magnificent ship to date? The whole world loves Her Majesty. It's the only thing that feels right. Well, I understand, and I agree with you. It would be apt, I think. Unfortunately, though, there are these traditionalists who might make a fuss. I can't imagine you'd want any sort of controversy to overshadow the launch. Well, no, certainly not, but perhaps there's a loophole. There usually is, I find. What if we simply called her the Queen Elizabeth? So, 2 Cunard ships named Queen Elizabeth? Well, they won't be in service at the same time. The old Queen Elizabeth is due to retire next year, and the Q4 won't be done with fitting out before then. There have been 2 Mauretanias and 2 Coronias in the past. I think a second Queen Elizabeth would be perfectly acceptable.
Michael looks away from Basil to the ship, as if trying out the name in his head.
Yes, all right, the Queen Elizabeth, then. It's a clever workaround, and Her Majesty will be pleased, I'm sure. But I'm almost reluctant to tell her. You know, there's something rather powerful about the fact that only you and I know this ship's name. So you won't tell anyone else? Well, except Her Majesty, obviously. No, I think it would be bad luck, I suppose, to let anyone else know before the christening. I think so. And I really can't afford much more bad luck right now.
Later that month, Basil Smallpiece stood beside Queen Elizabeth II at the launch of the Q4. When it came time for the Queen to announce the new ship's name, she was handed a slip of paper with Queen Elizabeth written on it. But she didn't even read it before confidently declaring,
"I name this ship Queen Elizabeth II."
Basil was surprised but delighted. The Queen had given the Q4 the name he'd always wanted, and it wouldn't be long before most people simply called the new liner the QE2. But whatever name it went by, for Basil and Cunard, the QE2 was more than just a new ship. It was a symbol of a new age, and it had to be a new success. From Wondery, I'm Lindsey Graham, and this is Business Movers. By the fall of 1967, Basil Smallpiece had been at the Cunard Line for over 3 years. When he took charge at the company, Cunard was a far cry from its glory days in the 1930s. Back then, Cunard had been at the cutting edge of technology, and its ships were as famous as movie stars. By the time Basil arrived, though, the company was fading. Its business had been almost destroyed by the emergence of the jet passenger plane, and losses were mounting. As Cunard chairman, Basil immediately implemented reforms to improve the company's bottom line. Ways of doing business that had served Cunard well in the past were jettisoned, as Basil tried to make the century-old company fit for the 1960s. Staff were laid off and ships were sold. But Basil knew he couldn't simply cut his way to prosperity. His long-term strategy rested on 3 main pillars. He hoped to streamline Cunard's cargo operations through containerization and expand the business into new routes through a partnership with the Australian government. And he planned a complete overhaul of the company's passenger fleet to allow Cunard to pivot more towards leisure travel. The grand liners of old were to be retired and replaced by a gleaming new flagship, and the Queen Elizabeth II, or QE2, was scheduled to enter service in 1969. She would be much cheaper to run than her predecessors and could spend half the year operating on the increasingly lucrative cruise routes. But each of Basil's 3 core strategic projects had already encountered difficulties, from complex startup costs to government bureaucracy and an almost disastrous shortfall in cash. All 3 projects had survived, but all 3 still had a long way to go and could easily fall apart before Cunard saw any benefits from them. Basil was anxious to give each project the best possible chance of success. He'd already traveled to the other side of the world, and now he decided to go where no other Cunard chairman had gone before, into a partnership with a rival foreign company, one that had been a thorn in Cunard's side for nearly 100 years. This is the 4th episode in our 4-part series on Cunard. Bon voyage. It's November 1967 in Southampton, 2 months after the christening of the QE2. Basil Smallpiece sits in the first-class dining hall of the France, the flagship of Cunard's rivals, the French Line. He looks around admiringly. There are enough tables for over 400 guests here, and above a grand central staircase, ornate columns soar up to a domed, cathedral-like ceiling. But the room is mostly empty today. Basil swallows his last bit of tarte tatin and sets down his fork. Basil's host is a 61-year-old man with thick, dark eyebrows and sharp features, the French Line's president, Edmond Lanier. Edmond delights in Basil's clear admiration for the room and his enjoyment of the dessert. So, how was that? So much better than your English puddings, no? Basil smiles, joining in on the fun. Well, it's no jam roly-poly, but I forced it down. Do not worry, Mr. Smallpiece. I would not dream of telling your colleagues how much you like our food. Enjoyed it. I overindulged. I may have to ask for a cabin neck so I can take a nap. Well, I'm sure that can be arranged. We have enough which are free, unfortunately. Yeah, a problem I know all too well. But it occurs to me that a problem shared is, as they say, a problem halved. Edmund looks at Basil quizzically. Basil goes on. You see, in the past, our 2 companies delighted in mutual competition. There were more than enough passengers to go around, and well, it spurred on both of our efforts, didn't it? But the days of our illustrious forebears have sadly passed. And now, here we are, both of us still running a weekly service to New York, and both of us selling barely half our cabins on every voyage. Yes, it is true. It grieves me to see it. 2 ships running half empty at the same time clearly isn't working. So why don't we do something about it? What is it you suggest? Cunard could sail to New York one week, and the French Line could follow the next. We'd alternate, back and forth, and that way every week there would be one of our liners making the crossing east or west, but only one. We wouldn't be duplicating our efforts in a market that clearly can't sustain it any longer. Edmund leans back in his chair. Oh, I don't know, Basil. We're competitors, no? Rivals? How would it look? It would look like good business. And to be frank, I'm not sure either of us can afford not to team up. Edmund glances around at the cavernous dining hall, silently considering Basil's offer. It would be marvelous to see this room full of life once again. Is that a yes? Edmund smiles. Let us consult our boards, but yes. I think we can come to an arrangement. Well, that's wonderful. Please, let me shake your hand. The 2 men seal their deal with a handshake across the dinner table. Do you have time for a tour of the rest of the ship? From what you say, it might soon become much busier. Certainly, Edmund, I'd be honored. It is a beautiful ship. Edmund reaches for his wine glass. Good. But I think before we do that, we should toast. To new friendship. Basil raises his glass in return. To a new entente cordiale. Over the next few months, Basil Smallpiece continued to meet with Edmond Lanier to hash out the details of their new partnership. The 2 men decided that in the following summer of 1968, Cunard and the French Line would offer a joint transatlantic service using the old Queen Elizabeth and the France. If all went well, the 2 companies would then coordinate their schedules again in 1969, when the QE2 was scheduled to enter service. Basil was beginning to feel cautiously optimistic. After all the storms Cunard had faced, he could almost see the safety of port. Now he just had to steer the company home. Ever since Basil Smallpiece arrived at Cunard, he had kept a close grip on the company's finances. But at the beginning of 1968, Basil felt so confident about Cunard's future that he decided it was time to hand over some of the responsibilities. So Basil appointed 55-year-old Philip Shirley as Cunard's deputy chairman and new finance director. Philip had once worked for British Rail, and he was a forensic-minded accountant who Basil thought highly of. And Philip immediately made Basil's life easier. One of his first jobs was to help coordinate the sale of Cunard's remaining passenger liners. The Corinthia, Sylvania, Caronia, and the grand old Queen Elizabeth would all finish their scheduled passenger services for Cunard in 1968. Then they'd be transferred to new owners. In total, the 4 ships netted Cunard a much-needed £7 million at auction, or almost $200 million today. It was a windfall that further improved Cunard's recovering financial position. As a result, Basil and Philip agreed that the company could afford to reduce its outstanding loan from the British government to £20 million. That represented a cut of almost 20% in the company's debt to the British Treasury and considerably reduced Cunard's interest payments. Costs were also slashed on the North Atlantic by Basil's new deal with the French line. In the summer of 1968, Cunard began the joint service arrangement with its old rival. And just as Basil had hoped, it led to more ticket sales and higher profits, ensuring that the final travel season of the original Queen Elizabeth was a successful one. After losing £25 million in total on the passenger business between 1961 and 67, Basil had now managed to reduce those losses to zero. And with the maiden voyage of the QE2 scheduled for 1969, he hoped to finally move Cunard's passenger service from merely breaking even and into profitability. In the summer of 1968, one frustration at least still preyed on Basil Smallpiece's mind. For months, he had been in negotiations with the Australian government over the purchase of a stake in Cunard's cargo subsidiary, Portline. Australia's Secretary of Trade and Industry, Alan Westerman, had seemed to like the idea when Basil suggested it, but the proposal had gotten repeatedly delayed by political wrangling. Finally, in August 1968, Basil heard from the Australian government in Canberra, and it wasn't good news. Alan Westerman informed Basil that Australia would not be taking a stake in Cunard. In the proposed deal, Cunard would still have owned the majority of the Portline, and the ships would have sailed under a British flag. That was now against government policy. Basil was disappointed, but only briefly, because he realized there was a workaround. It would involve the Associated Container Transportation Consortium. The ACT was the joint venture he formed in 1966 that pooled the resources of several different British shipping companies and shared the costs of transitioning the cargo industry to container ships. And several of the companies involved in the ACT had an interest in trade to Australia. So the ACT had formed a separate venture called the Associated Container Transportation Australia, or ACTA, and it was this group that was Basil's ticket to a partnership with the Australian government. So long as an Australian shipping company was allowed to join the conglomerate and at least one of its container ships sailed under an Australian flag, then the Australian government was happy to join the ACTA. And this partnership wouldn't only involve shipping to and from Britain. The Australian government also agreed to include trade between Australia and North America in the deal. This was a big win for Basil. Previously, British carriers had only had a weak position on these routes, but now Cunard had been given an entry into a rapidly expanding market. By the time the partnership with the Australian government was made official, it had been nearly 2 years since Basil first approached Alan Westerman. So now Basil had just to hope that it would be worth the wait. In the meantime, he had another pressing matter to deal with on the passenger side of the business. The old Queen Mary had already left Cunard's service and been sold off to the city of Long Beach in California. Now, after a final summer on the North Atlantic, it was time for the Mary's sister ship, the Queen Elizabeth, to follow her into retirement. She too had been bought by Americans, and her new home was to be the city of Philadelphia. The Queen Elizabeth's retirement was a poignant memory for many at Cunard. The iconic liner represented the glory days of the company, and for 2 decades she had been the largest passenger ship afloat anywhere in the world, and was still a shining example of luxury transatlantic travel at its finest. But the Queen Elizabeth and her older sister Queen Mary were tied to Britain's history by more than just their commercial operations. Both ships had served diligently during World War II, and at the end of that conflict, their contribution to the war effort had been summed up by none other than Sir Winston Churchill himself, who said, "Built for the arts of peace and to link the old world with the new, the Queens challenged the fury of Hitlerism in the Battle of the Atlantic. At a speed never before realized in war, they carried over 1 million men to defend the liberties of civilization. to those who contributed to the success of our operations in the years of peril, and to those who brought these two great ships into existence, the world owes a debt that it will not be easy to measure. On November 6, 1968, the Queen Elizabeth officially retired from Cunard service. The next day, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, the woman the ship was named after, visited Southampton to bid her namesake a final farewell. Accompanied by the Cunard board, the Queen Mother had lunch in the ship's veranda grill, a popular spot where countless celebrities and English nobility had dined during the 20 years the ship had spent crisscrossing the Atlantic. Basil was at this lunch, but he had little time for nostalgia or sharing stories of the past. It was Cunard's future that Basil was most concerned with, and that depended not on the Queen Elizabeth, but on QE2. Basil expected the new liner to begin her sea trials in less than a month, and the ship had to be ready for the following summer. That was peak travel season on the North Atlantic. But as this deadline approached, Basil began to worry. Concerning reports about possible delays were emerging from the shipyard in Scotland, and soon Basil would discover that the new Cunard ship wasn't just unfinished, she was unseaworthy. It's the early hours of December 28, 1968, at Basil Smallpiece's home in London, 7 weeks after the retirement of RMS Queen Elizabeth. Wearing his pajamas and a robe, Basil hangs up the phone in the hallway and rubs his eyes. His wife, Kay, has only recently returned from the hospital after being diagnosed with an incurable blood disease. Now Basil has been informed that the engines on the new QE2 have failed during a test cruise to the Canary Islands. It's an emergency, and Basil must decide whether or not to leave his sick wife to attend to the matter. Basil pads down the hallway to the bedroom to check in on Kay. She seems to be sleeping, and Basil is about to tiptoe away when Kay calls out.
Who was that?
No one. Wrong number. You go back to sleep. Do you typically stay on the phone with wrong numbers for 10 minutes?
You were awake then. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Kay turns on the bedside light and blinks.
So who was it?
It was the captain of the QE2. There's been a malfunction. 5 days earlier, the QE2 set off from Britain on a test voyage to the Canary Islands off the coast of Africa. Hundreds of Cunard staff and their families were invited along, both as a thank you for all their efforts and as an opportunity to troubleshoot any problems on board. But these first passengers were horrified by what they found. Some cabins, crew quarters, and public lounges were still unfinished, and tools, lumber, and dust were everywhere. Now, though, it seems that there are more than just cosmetic problems with the new ship.
There's been a malfunction, something to do with the engines. They're towing her to Las Palmas. No one seems to know what the issue is yet, but it's so bad they think we may have to reject delivery.
Kay pushes herself up in bed and looks at Basil with concern.
Oh, darling, I'm sorry. They want me to fly out tomorrow for a board meeting. But I can't leave you here. It's okay, I'll be all right.
Kay, you're not well.
I can manage. I'm just going to tell the board to fix it without me. Basil, no, you're not.
Basil sighs. His wife knows him too well.
Well, I do trust them with most things, you know, if it were anything else. But the QE2, it's so important to the future of the company.
Basil, look, if you don't go, I'll have to listen to your constant phone calls and watch you pace around the house all day anyway. So please, go deal with it, and then come back to me. Basil looks into his wife's eyes adoringly.
Oh, thank you.
Besides, it's hardly the first time I've had to compete with a ship for your attention. Basil smiles. He's glad his wife hasn't lost her sense of humor. She pulls back the covers and swings her legs out of bed.
Now come on, let's pack your things. Oh, I'm sure we can sleep a few more hours at least.
No, darling, fetch your suitcase. You have a ship to rescue. Later that very morning, Basil Smallpiece boarded a flight for the Canary Islands, where the crippled QE2 waited in port. As Basil watched the sea slide by beneath the window of his plane, he wondered what he'd find on board the new liner when he arrived, and what he could possibly say to the dozens of reporters who had traveled with the ship to Las Palmas and were now expecting answers. When Basil Smallpiece landed in Las Palmas, he boarded the unfinished QE2 and went straight to the card room on the quarterdeck for a meeting with the company's other senior executives. The card room at least had chairs to sit in. They were a luxurious green suede that complemented the felt of the rosewood card tables. But even here, Basil thought he detected a thin coating of construction dust on the furniture, and the sound of work going on elsewhere in the ship couldn't be ignored. While the board discussed what the company should do, Cunard's engineers worked with the makers of the QE2 in order to determine the cause of the engine failure. If they couldn't figure out the problem, Cunard would have to refuse delivery of the ship and withhold all future payments to the shipbuilders. This would be disastrous. Basil had expected the QE2 to begin commercial service in under 2 weeks. A maiden cruise on January 10, 1969 had been heavily promoted in the press, and if the QE2 wasn't ready in time, it would mean that advertising had been a complete waste, and all the tickets sold would have to be refunded. The board meeting in the QE2's card room lasted 8 hours before finally wrapping up at 4 in the morning. There was no positive news, though. As well as the engine problems, Basil was told that 85 cabins on board were still entirely unfinished, and there were countless minor defects elsewhere that needed correcting. Basil's worst fear was coming true. The QE2 would have to cancel its heavily advertised maiden voyage. After snatching a few hours' rest, at 9:30 a.m., Basil held a press conference to brief the media on board about what had happened. He told the reporters that Cunard would refuse to take delivery of the ship as planned on January 1, 1969, saying, "Under no circumstances are we prepared to send the QE2 on a commercial voyage until we are satisfied that the standards she can offer are what she was designed for." Basil's words were quickly relayed to the crew of the QE2. The news wasn't so terrible for the staff. They would be retained on standby with full pay. But their salaries were another sunk cost for Cunard. In total, the company stood to lose over £500,000 as a result of this debacle, equivalent of over $13 million today. So as the QE2 limped back to England at 2/3 her usual cruising speed, the ship's surprise delay made newspaper headlines around the world. Luckily for Basil and Cunard, most reports were sympathetic to the company and blamed the shipbuilders for the issues. Basil and Cunard had made it clear they would not accept the new ship in its current state. So with Cunard's future, as well as the reputation of shipbuilding in Britain on the line, the shipbuilders immediately set to work. It was determined that the fault was in the turbine blades, an issue that should have been caught in early stages of testing. Still, the shipbuilders assured Basil that the delay would only be a few months. The QE2 would finally be ready in late April of '69. Basil was relieved, but still nervous. April would be just in the nick of time for the summer travel season. Any further delay would be catastrophic. This time, however, the shipmakers delivered on their promise. The turbine blades were fixed and the unfinished cabins completed. QE2 then made another shakedown cruise to the Canary Islands in April 1969, and this time, the new Queen passed her test with flying colors. At last, Cunard agreed to take delivery of the 65,000-ton ship ready for her maiden transatlantic voyage on May 2nd. Despite all the problems, Basil was delighted with the $70 million liner and confidently declared that the QE2 was the most superb example of the shipbuilder's craft the world has yet seen. The day before the liner's departure from England, Queen Elizabeth II visited her namesake in Southampton. She met with Basil, Cunard officers, and the ship's crew. Basil was delighted. He felt that the Queen's visit was the best possible send-off the new ship could have, and the next morning, the QE2 set sail for America with 1,500 paying passengers on board. When she reached New York 5 days later, the QE2 was welcomed by a flotilla of small ships, by fireboats shooting sprays of water, and by the cheers of thousands of onlookers. Countless whistles and horns echoed through the harbor as the new liner followed the route of her famous predecessors up the Hudson River to the Cunard dock. The QE2's maiden voyage had gone off without a hitch. And over the summer of 1969, Cunard's new flagship completed 11 more round voyages across the Atlantic, each one at a profit. The old queens of the Atlantic were gone, but now a new queen ruled the waves. The QE2 was not Cunard's only important maiden voyage in May of 1969. At the end of the month, the first container ship of the ACT consortium set off on its inaugural trip from Europe to Australia. It was a momentous occasion, the result of years of hard work and millions of pounds of investment. For Basil, it was a long-awaited step into the future for the cargo side of Cunard's business, And as more container ships were delivered, serving more routes around the globe, he was confident that the ACT could only grow. And it was Cunard's share of the revenues from the ACT that helped the company to its best results in over a decade. In 1969, Cunard posted total profits of £3 million. Basil was over the moon. His short-term cost-cutting had been painful at times, especially for the 3,000 Cunard employees who had lost their jobs. But Basil had successfully kept the business going until his long-term strategies could pay off. The threat of bankruptcy had hovered over Cunard for years. Now, though, the company could pay off more of its loan with the government, and Basil was at least confident that he had found a way for the century-old shipping firm to survive in the jet age. But while he celebrated these successes, Basil remained cautious. Cunard's profit margins were still slender, and its cash reserves were weak. He knew a slump in either the passenger or cargo market could leave the company vulnerable again. Basil might have steered Cunard to safety for now, but he had learned from his time at the company that a new storm was never far away. It's July 1970 at Cunard's headquarters in London, over a year after the maiden voyage of the QE2. Basil Smallpiece makes his way down a hallway and enters the office of his finance director, Cunard's deputy chairman, Philip Shirley. Basil has come to hear the latest forecast from the company's accountants. After last year's profits of £3 million, Basil is hopeful that Cunard can at least maintain its performance. He greets Philip enthusiastically as he takes a seat.
Well, I've been waiting all morning to hear some good news.
Well, perhaps you should come back this afternoon then, after you've heard some good news elsewhere.
Oh, I don't like the sound of that.
You're not trying to take my expectations down a notch, are you?
I'm afraid not. Because I'm not expecting a miracle, even just a modest increase.
Well, I'm afraid it's quite the opposite, Basil. It's not an increase at all. Basil's face drops. He's never been one to overreact, but he can't help feeling he's been punched in the gut. Unfortunately, our December projections have not come to pass. Both passenger and cargo figures are down, and we've had to revise our estimates significantly.
How much?
On the cargo side, we're down on the Australian routes, India as well. Atlantic cargo is holding up, but the QE2 is slipping back, and its first cruise season hasn't posted the numbers we hope for.
Well, no, but she needs a little more promotion. The Americans have to get to know her as a cruise ship as well as a liner, and that's going to take some time.
Well, yes, but the long and short of it is we're currently predicting profits £1 million lower than last year. And I think there's a serious risk we undershoot even that. Looking at these trends, to be frank, Basil, I wouldn't rule out another operating loss come the end of the year. Basil stares straight ahead for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. Philip tries to find some words of comfort.
But this is what the shipping industry is like, isn't it? It's cyclical. We're not the only ones suffering. I know there have been job losses at P&O, for instance, but of course they do have rather larger reserves than us, and they've not had to make the cuts we have, so there's more fat for them to trim. Anyway, Basil, I'm sorry. I wish I had better news to share. The share price will take a hit.
I imagine so. And that will leave us vulnerable if this goes on.
To take over?
Yes. A recently profitable company where the hard yards of reform have been done, going through a temporary dip. If I were one of those circling sharks, I might try to take a bite myself. So would I. So what do you suppose we should do about it?
Well, in all honesty, Philip, I just don't know.
By 1970, Basil Smallpiece thought he had effectively restored Cunard to operational sustainability. But the accountant's report in July of that year showed that even Basil's best efforts might not be enough. Having hauled Cunard back from the brink, Basil now seemed powerless to stop the company sliding back towards disaster. Over the next several months, Basil Smallpiece kept a close eye on Cunard's stock price. He had long had a difficult relationship with Cunard's shareholders. When he first arrived at the company, many had regarded him as a novice, an airlines man who had no business in shipping. Later, he was criticized for not paying out more in dividends from the sale of assets. But when Cunard shares hit recent record prices, those critics had been mostly silenced. But Basil knew he had few loyal allies among the shareholders, and as Cunard's finances declined further over the course of 1970, its stock price sank lower and lower, and Basil's critics crept out of the woodwork once again. By January 1971, Cunard's share price had dropped by more than half. Basil knew that such a dip would make Cunard very attractive to investors looking to take over the company, and that many of Cunard's shareholders would support such a move. And in June of 1971, Basil's fears became reality. He received a message from the chairman of Trafalgar House Investments asking for a meeting. Trafalgar House was a property and construction conglomerate, but he was looking to diversify, and Cunard seemed to be the perfect fit. Trafalgar offered to buy out Cunard at a price of £1.85 per share. Basil wanted to oppose the bid, but his advisors told him that the only way to convince shareholders to reject the takeover was if he could show that the company's prospects were so bright that a higher share price could be achieved without the sale. But the company's own internal reports showed that profits in the years to come were likely to be meager at best. In these circumstances, there was little Basil could do but try to achieve the best price possible for the company. He managed to increase Trafalgar's bid by 30 pence to £2.10 per share, which Basil still thought was a bargain, but he couldn't stop the deal going through. On August 25, 1971, more than 130 years after Samuel Cunard began carrying mail and passengers across the Atlantic by steamship, the company that bore his name held its last board meeting as an independent firm. Shortly after the acquisition, most of the senior managers who had overseen Cunard's turnaround lost their jobs. Basil stayed on as a member of the new board for 5 months before he too left. The similarities between Basil's time in the airlines and shipping industries frustrated him. At both BOAC and Cunard, Basil had helped restore profitability. And at both companies, he had been forced out before he felt his work was done. Still, Basil took immense pride in the achievements of the 7 years he spent at Cunard. Not all his decisions had been popular, and he was dubbed Captain Courageous by some in the English press for the bravery of his leadership. But he had successfully reshaped a failing company and given it a chance to thrive in a new post-jet era. The same could not be said for many of Cunard's old rivals on the North Atlantic. They did not survive the technological disruption caused by the jet engine. The United States line stopped carrying passengers in 1969, and the French line became defunct in 1976. The Cunard Line, however, lives on to this day under the ownership of the American cruise conglomerate Carnival. The company has changed since the days of Basil Smallpiece. Cunard no longer operates any cargo ships, and Carnival's tenure has seen the retirement of the QE2 after almost 40 years of service. But there are still 3 modern Cunard Queens at sea, the Queen Elizabeth and the Queen Victoria cruise ships, and the last true ocean liner in the world, the Queen Mary II. The fleet is set to grow again, though, in 2024, with the addition of Cunard's newest cruise ship, the state-of-the-art $600 million Queen Anne. Each of these grand ships boasts a sleek black hull and white decks, lined with the instantly recognizable Cunard red. These ships, and all who sail in them, owe a debt of gratitude to Basil Smallpiece. In the face of rapid technological change that threatened to destroy his company, Basil adapted, Cunard evolved, and Cunard survived. From Wondery, this is episode 4 of Steering Cunard Off the Rocks for Business Movers. On the next episode, writer and filmmaker David Ellery discusses the golden age of the ocean liner and how passenger shipping has continued to evolve since Basil Smallpiece left Cunard. It's November 1970 in Port Everglades, Florida, aboard the ocean liner formerly known as the RMS Queen Elizabeth. 64-year-old retired Commodore Jeffrey Marr clicks on his flashlight and sweeps its beam down the hallway. Jeffrey was the Queen Elizabeth's last captain when she was with Cunard. Now he's returned to his old ship to give advice to the Queen Elizabeth's new owner, but the ship looks nothing like Jeffrey remembers it. The once sparkling interiors are dark and dingy. There's an emergency generator on board providing power, but there's not enough for the lights. So with only his flashlight to guide him, Jeffrey makes his way down the hall and up a flight of stairs to the ship's writing room. Waiting for Jeffrey there is the ship's new owner, Chinese shipping magnate C.Y. Tung. "Commodore, wonderful to see you again." "A pleasure, Mr. Tung. Have a seat. Would you like some tea?" "Please." Jeffrey takes a seat and looks around. Here, at least, he's pleased to see the leather-lined seats in the alcoves remain just as they were during the ship's glory days. The ship has changed hands a few times since she left Cunard's service 2 years ago. Now CY is planning to convert the ship into a floating college called CY's University, a play on words with his own name. But CY needs to get the aging ship to Hong Kong for a full refurbishment, and he's hired Jeffrey to advise on the journey.
Does it feel strange to be back, Commodore? A little bit, I must say. I have a lot of memories of this ship. Oh, don't worry, though. We'll take good care of her. I'm glad to hear it. She's in a rather sorry state, though, isn't she? Yes, the Americans have not looked after her properly, but once we get her to Hong Kong, she will be reborn. Well, I wanted to talk about, actually, not your plans, which, as I've said before, are most exciting, but it's the trip to Hong Kong. You're going to have to tow her, I'm afraid. Tow her? Why? Well, she's more than 30 years old, for one thing. But I've been over the ship with the chief engineer, and she's just been sitting in these warm Florida waters for too long. There's rust creeping up her sides, her oil tanks have flooded, her boilers and engines are in no shape to take her out of the harbor, let alone make it all the way to Hong Kong. But you yourself called her the finest liner ever to cross the Atlantic. She can't make one more journey? Well, she was the finest ship in history, but now I'm sad to say she's little more than a rusting hulk. Oh, don't be so negative, Commodore. I'm trying to be realistic, Mr. Tom. Well, it seems I have more faith in your old ship than you do. I'd like her to travel under her own power, Commodore. Just tell me what needs to be done. Money is no object.
Jeffrey seems torn, so CY pushes on.
You see, nobody wants to see this great ship towed away like an old lady being guided across the street. Imagine the spectacle, the Queen Elizabeth gliding into Hong Kong, smoke rising above her funnels. Wouldn't you like to see that just one more time?
Yes, I would.
So tell me what we need to do. You will see, Commodore, that this will be the finale she always deserved.
CY Tong spent almost $1 million making repairs to the Queen Elizabeth for her voyage east. But it wasn't enough. The journey was meant to take a few weeks, but instead, the disastrous voyage took 5 months. The Queen Elizabeth finally limped into Hong Kong harbor in July 1971. There, a huge program of renovations began. But just when the ship was nearing completion, tragedy struck. A mysterious arson attack destroyed the great liner. The Queen Elizabeth had once been the largest passenger ship ever built. Now, however, her fate was the same as the entire transatlantic shipping industry. Despite all the efforts to help her survive, she was doomed to become a relic of the past. From Wondery, I'm Lindsey Graham, and this is Business Movers. When Samuel Cunard founded his transatlantic mail service in 1840, he built it on world-changing technology, the steam engine. But when jet airliners upended the passenger steamship business in the late 1950s, it seemed that the venerable Cunard Line would surely go under. Cunard was rescued, though, by Basil Smallpiece, a British accountant and former airline executive. In his early years at the shipping company, Basil compared Cunard to a living organism bound by Darwinian principles of evolution. It could adapt or it could die. In Cunard's case, that meant remaking the 100-year-old company for a world where the foundation of its business model had evaporated. The shipping business would never be the same again, and that meant Cunard could never be the same again. Basil modernized Cunard's cargo operations. He scaled back its passenger business and put a greater focus on the emerging market of cruises and leisure travel. Basil successfully saved the company from collapse, but he was forced to leave Cunard before the fruits of his labor had fully ripened. By 1978, though, the new ship QE2 was bringing an annual revenue of £30 million, around $277 million today. Much of that came from the winter months, when the QE2 would leave the chilly North Atlantic and become a sun-chasing cruise ship. In the decades since, the cruise industry has only become more important to passenger shipping companies like the Cunard Line. In the late 1990s, Cunard was purchased by the American Carnival Corporation. Now a conglomerate of 9 cruise line brands, Carnival has a combined fleet of over 90 vessels and an annual revenue of over $21 billion. But its most famous and most prestigious brand remains Cunard, the shipping line which carried the rich and the poor, the famous and the forgotten, across the oceans and back again for more than 100 years. Here to talk about that golden age of ocean liners and the development of passenger shipping industry in the modern world is author and filmmaker David Ellery. David Ellery, thank you for speaking with me today on Business Movers.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Now, you have written several books about Cunard's most famous ships, including the Queen Mary and the QE2. What fascinates you about ocean liners?
Well, we can talk about the way a ship is designed and made, the materials and so on, the nuts and bolts, if you like. But I think really the interesting part for me, certainly, is the people, the history behind it. That's what brings it to life. So who were the people who built the ship? Who were the designers? Who were the captains and crew? And who travelled aboard from someone perhaps emigrating to a new country to start a new life, or someone travelling during the war if the ship were converted to troop carrier, to someone who was perhaps rich or famous, maybe a film star, head of state, member of the royal family even. They each have their own very different story, but they have the ship in common. And so I think it's fascinating how ocean liners can link people and places and have such a huge impact on the way history has been shaped.
I suppose the golden age of ocean travel was probably the 1930s. Why was it this period that was so magnificent for transatlantic travel?
You're absolutely right. I think the 1930s certainly are an era we think of as the golden age of ocean liners. I think we need to remember also that it was at the same time an era of very great hardship. The early years of the 1930s were the years of the Great Depression following the Wall Street crash in October 1929. The Western world was suffering a period of great economic hardship, even to the point that the building of Cunard's newest liner, which was Britain's largest ship, came to a halt because the money to build her simply ran out. So for most ordinary working class people, the early 30s especially, were a really bleak time. It was also a time of political unrest, of course, in Europe. But on the other side of that coin, it was also a very glamorous age. We had Art Deco design reflected in architecture, in furniture, artwork, fashion, and so on. And of course, in our transport as well. Cars were becoming sleeker, faster, and streamlined, as were railway locomotives and aircraft and so on. And I think in a really tangible way, the newer ocean liners encapsulated grandeur, elegance, speed, everything that was the spirit of the age, really.
One of the interesting things about the shipping industry during this period is that it wasn't just a competition between different corporations, different lines, but also a competition between different countries. How is that so?
Yeah, if we look back to the decades before the 1930s, we see a pattern of nations vying for supremacy on the North Atlantic. There was great rivalry between countries like Germany, France, and Britain to have the largest and the fastest liners. And we see from around the turn of last century, those countries really striving to outdo one another. And so ships progressively grew larger, technically more advanced, and they effectively became really a showcase for a nation's ability, for their technical abilities, their design, style, and artistry, and so on. So it was all there in the ocean liner. And at that time, Britain, for example, was the dominant nation on the North Atlantic with Cunard ships, the Campania and the Lusitania. White Star had their ship, the Teutonic, but Germany wanted to break that monopoly, so launched their ship, which was the Kaiser Wilhelm de Gross, in 1897, which then became the largest and fastest liner in the world. It was around about 14,000, just over 14,000 tons. The Hamburg America line in Germany also responded with a slightly larger ship in 1900, the Deutschland. And then in turn, Britain responded with two new ships, the Lusitania and the Mauretania, which reached around about 32,000 tons. So again, up again in size. That was in 1907. Then a few years later on came White Star's Olympic, Titanic and Britannic, which most people probably would have heard of, particularly Titanic. which were more than 45,000 tons. So there were various other ships in the mix as well, of course, along the way. But eventually we get to the 1930s and the world's three superliners, the largest ever built at that point, Normandy of France and Britain's Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth. Normandy was the most technically advanced and most streamlined and altogether more glitzy than the British ships, which were much more traditional in their style. And that was a conscious decision by Cunard, which actually proved to be very wise. But interestingly, many of these big companies were helped and encouraged by their country. So it was really very much a matter of national pride as much as it was a matter of company pride.
Well, let's get into the nuts and bolts of these fine ships for a moment. This arms race of a sort, what technological advances were enabling these ships to become grander, larger, faster?
It was a time of innovation. There's no doubt about that. During that 1930s period, Normandy, for example, she was really very much a state-of-the-art ship. Around that time, there was a lot of development, a lot of research concerning hull design and engine technology. Now, Normandy's designers actually embraced both of those. She had turbo-electric propulsion and the hull design, which was much more efficient than previous ships, as it reduced the amount of drag and gave a better fuel efficiency. And in fact, her designer, who had previously worked for the Russian Navy, but by then was living in France, he originally, in fact, approached Cunard with these designs, but they felt they were just too revolutionary, believe it or not, so they didn't go down that road. So instead, Cunard's new ship, which eventually became Queen Mary, was much more traditional, reflecting what the company knew and trusted. But that said, they certainly embraced other areas of technical advancement. For example, when it came to safety, the new Cunard ship had the most up-to-date automated system aboard with watertight doors. They had 66, in fact, watertight doors, 38 of which could be operated by power from the bridge and controlled remotely. They also had a very advanced designed lifeboats, all of which were motorized, which was, again, it sounds basic, but it was an advancement in those days. And also they had a very comprehensive fire detection and extinguishing system on board as well, so that areas which weren't populated by any of the crew or passengers, such as the garage areas and stores and so on, could actually be, if a fire were detected, could be extinguished remotely by carbon dioxide. And in the passenger areas, they had an advanced sprinkler system. So there were lots of areas which were, in that sense, being embraced for their technical advancement by the British ship. Other things, such as just the day-to-day equipment, for example, in the kitchens, they had electric dishwashers and electric potato peelers, which were, in Britain at that time, gadgetry which was completely unheard of. That was so advanced, it was unbelievable. So although the French designers and the French company were miles ahead in terms of the hull and the engine design, the British were taking on other areas which were certainly technically advanced, but at the same time deliberately maintaining a ship which, in terms of design, was much more traditional.
The story of Cunard is largely one of evolution, and one of the hardships that the company ran up against was a change in their business model, a change due to introduced limits on immigration from Europe to America, because Cunard, like many shipping companies, made a lot of their profits carrying immigrants from Europe to America. How did they adapt to this significant change?
Yeah, I think it's easy actually to overlook the fact that you mentioned there that for all their glitz and glamour, the profitability of shipping lines was very often reliant on their third-class or steerage-class customers. In the first part of the 20th century, half a ship's capacity might be given over to third class. In ships prior to that, an even bigger proportion. It was a very, very important part of the market. And as you say, all this changed during the 1920s when restrictions came in on the number of new settlers that could be brought into the United States. So that meant that the new generation of ships changed in terms of who they were accommodating as third-class numbers. So naturally, as those numbers went down, the ships had to change in their design accordingly. The ships, if they weren't new, would have had to have been to some extent adapted, but new ships, the design was adapted before it even got to the point of building. But then in the case of Cunard, the company actually went a bit further as well. Queen Mary was a 3-class ship, like most liners, but in the 1930s, Cunard chose to call their classes cabin, tourist and third, rather than first, second and third. At that time, the passenger shipping companies had a trade agreement, and that concerned the conditions on board the ships, the level of service they offered them, and very importantly, the minimum rates for the cost of the first and second class passages. So by calling their new liner a cabin class ship, Cunard could set their own prices.
For the bulk of our series, we covered the crisis that ocean liners faced as they were supplanted by passenger jet planes in the 1960s. Do you think that it helped that Basil Smallpiece, who came in to help with this problem, was an outsider coming from the airline industry? Was this an advantage?
I think it's probably helpful in general, in some ways, for a new broom, so as to speak, to come in from a different industry, in the sense that they're able to offer a fresh perspective and are more likely to embrace change, perhaps, rather than delay change and hold on to old traditions and old values. I think that the very fact that Sir Basil came from the airline industry was possibly an even bigger advantage. He was probably better placed to not only foresee the significance of the challenges of the jet age, but also the need for Cunard to react as quickly as possible if they were to survive. But I think it was actually that speed of the decision to sell the Queen liners that surprised a lot of people. I've spoken with a number of former officers and crew over the years, and it's very clear to them that they couldn't carry on as things were. Passenger numbers were dwindling during winter months especially. Queen Mary had a crew of around 1,100 people or so, and sometimes that outnumbered the passengers 2 to 1. Sometimes it was even worse than that. So it was clear to the crew that things couldn't carry on the way they were. However, I think most crew thought that they would probably have another 5 years or so before anything was drastically done. And that, in part, was because Queen Mary received a refit costing more than £1 million just shortly before the announcement that she was going to be taken out of service. So I think crew felt at that point their immediate future and the future of the ship was fairly safe. But then it was announced that both Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth were to be taken out of service within just a matter of months rather than years. But there's a certain irony, I think, that Sir Basil, as managing director of BOAC, which was Britain's state airline, ushered in, effectively, the jet travel with Britain's first jet-powered transatlantic services in October 1958, and then was instrumental in the company investing in Boeing 707s and other jet aircraft. And there he was, a few years later, in charge of rescuing Cunard, effectively.
Now, of course, in this period, Cunard was not alone. How did other companies, the French line, the United States lines, how did they cope with this new world of jet travel?
Well, you mentioned the United States line there. In 1952, the SS United States of United States Line entered service. She was a ship of around 53,000 tons. She came in as a new transatlantic liner, significant because she immediately took the blue ribbon for the fastest North Atlantic crossing, which she still technically holds to this day, actually. So the line had the fastest, most modern liner on the Atlantic, but of course, they were still faced with exactly the same challenges as Cunard. In 1964, they sold their other liner, the smaller SS America, and by 1969, SS United States, the newer ship, was actually taken out of service and laid up. Now, in the case of the United States line, they also had a fleet of cargo ships, and so effectively they then concentrated on that side of their business rather than diversifying the passenger side of the business.
One of Basil Smallpiece's critical changes was the pivot towards cruise and away from year-round transatlantic travel. Can you clarify some of the key differences between ocean liners and cruise ships, both in terms of design and purpose, and what this switch might have entailed?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's really worth defining that difference because it does cause a lot of confusion for people. Essentially, to take the liners first, liners were part of the world's transportation system. They were part of that network of transport. If you wanted to travel in the 1930s and 40s and earlier than that to anywhere in the world overseas, it had to be by ship. Aircraft were not there in those days. So liners went from A to B as part of the transportation system. They performed line voyages, hence liners. And that was basically a scheduled route taking passengers and cargo from one place to the other. Cruise ships, on the other hand, are a very different beast in as much that, in a sense, they have become a destination in their own right. So although they go to lovely places, it's almost incidental where they go in the sense that they are not following a regular route, which is identical each time. They're taking passengers on a vacation. And consequently, the ships themselves are very different as well. The old liners used to be a 3-class ship, so there were different levels of opulence and different levels of accommodation according to the fares that they charged. In general, cruise ships tend not to be that way. They tend to be a single class throughout the ship. And in that sense, most passengers have the free run of every part of the ship. But then, of course, cruise ships, because they are a vacation ship, because they are a destination in some respects, are very different in what they have to provide as well. So a liner would have been, in terms of entertainment, there was some entertainment, but it would have been much more basic. There would have been perhaps an orchestra aboard and cinema facilities where films could be shown, that kind of thing. But of course, cruise ships, altogether different. The level of entertainment, which has grown over the years, even in the early days, there was a lot more of it because people expected that. They were going on a vacation, that's what they required. So in those senses, the ships were very different, both in their design and in their purpose.
Now, we ended our story pretty much at the departure of Basil Smallpiece from Cunard just as the company was acquired by Trafalgar House Investments. What happened after Sir Basil left? Were those good years for Cunard under Trafalgar?
I think it's probably fair to say that this was a mixed time for the company. In its heyday, I suppose through really to the demise of the North Atlantic trade, Cunard was synonymous with quality. It was all about delivering the very best possible service. Now, I've interviewed many former officers and crew over the years, and it was really clear how much pride they took in their ship and their jobs. I remember one of the former captains, Captain Peter Jackson, telling me that, to get a job with Cunard was an accolade in its own right, whatever level that would be, whether you were looking for a job as an officer or a regular crew person. To get a job with Cunard was really quite something. So I think there was a great culture of pride in the job that they were doing and so forth. Now, when we get to the Trafalgar period, which was 1971 to 1998, effectively, the company had changed in various ways by then. And during that time, in fact, there were 2 new ships that were introduced, Cunard Countess and Cunard Venturer. They came in, as well as 2 ships from the Norwegian-American cruise line as well. And there was a huge amount of money also invested in upgrading QE2. But by the mid-90s, QE2 was making headlines for the wrong reasons. She had a dreadful start to her 1994 season when renovation wasn't completed on time and she sailed from the dry dock early. There were lots of complaints as a result of that when things went wrong. And I think management put plenty of measures into place to try and rectify matters, but it did nothing for the ship's reputation, or for that matter, for Cunard's reputation at that time.
So then we move into a different phase of Cunard's history, and that's when Carnival came. What do you think attracted Carnival to try to acquire Cunard?
Well, by 1998, when Carnival showed interest in Cunard were operating 5 ships, and although they were marketed as a luxury brand, they were being dubbed in the press quite often as being a company that was losing money. So from that point of view, it wasn't at that point the Cunard of decades past. But the man behind Carnival, which is, as we all know, a huge success story in its own right, is a man called Mickey Arison. And I know from an interview that we did with him many years ago, which wasn't actually about Cunard, but he made it clear then that he highly values and has a high regard for heritage and history. But I also read in another interview subsequently that actually it was his daughter who played a part in his decision to buy Cunard. She was 15 at the time and dragged him along to watch the movie Titanic in 1997, which had just been released. It was after seeing that film that Mickey Arison started to think, well, QE2 will be at the end of her service life soon. When she goes, there'll be no more liners left anywhere. And so where would someone go to get the opportunity to relive the experience of their parents and grandparents and so on? That was a thought that was put in his mind by seeing Titanic and realising the tradition and the heritage. And he started looking at the possibility of building a brand new transatlantic liner. So to do that, Carnival first bought Cunard, and then they set about designing and building QM2. So it seems the acquisition of Cunard was very much down to Mickey Arison personally and his vision to build this new liner.
That leads me to my next question, because I suppose how has Cunard continued to evolve under the Carnival ownership? Is it as recognizable as the company it once was?
I think Cunard's evolved in a really positive way since becoming part of Carnival, actually. We've spoken about QM2 there, a ship of 149,000 tonnes. She went into service in 2004. She's proven to be a tremendous success, and the transatlantic voyages continue, which in my view is a really great thing in itself. But since then, the fleet has expanded further. In 2007, Queen Victoria came along, 90,000 tonnes. Then in 2010, the 92,000-tonne Queen Elizabeth. And now we're just on the verge of having Queen Anne come into service, 113,000 tonnes. So the fleet is certainly, I think, in really good shape with plenty of investment, and they look the part with traditional Cunard livery. But I think also those core values, going back to the point you were asking about old Cunard and new Cunard, I think those core values of quality of service, beautiful decor, top-notch cuisine, and smaller things like dressing for dinner, they're still very much part of the company as well. And I think these are things that clearly Cunard customers really appreciate. So there is still a good deal of the old essence of Cunard, I think, still reflected in modern-day Cunard.
One of the things that strikes me as consistent throughout the entire history of liners or cruise ships is that they continue to grow larger. What is the economic or technological basis for building bigger and bigger ships?
I think there's an element of prestige in some respects, but also I think it's sustainability in terms of commerce as well. That certainly comes into play. That is to say, it can be more economic to run a ship with a greater capacity than a smaller capacity. Not always, but often that's the way. Also, the ever-developing array of facilities aboard, which in terms of space requires more capacity as well. So I think that's what's behind the way in which ships, as you say, continually evolving and developing in terms of size. But I think there's also a downside to that actually as well. And that is that the port facilities and infrastructures are not growing necessarily at the same rate. And so there are, in fact, areas of the world where these vast cruise ships are not really welcome because they fear of ports being overrun, that their tourist areas are going to be oversaturated by such a great influx of tourists at any one time. And then, of course, there's other logistic difficulties as well, such as dry docking for repairs and so on. So I think they, whilst in one sense it can be a more economic and prestigious thing to be investing in ever larger ships, there are also a whole raft of challenges that opens up as well at the same time.
You mentioned that the QM2 was brought into service in 2004. That's 20 years ago.
Yeah.
How has the cruise industry changed in the last 2 decades? Is this a new golden age for passenger shipping?
Well, I certainly think we've definitely seen a huge increase in the number of ships. I think we've also seen more variety on offer in terms of cruise destinations. And consequently, as cruising has grown in popularity, it's become, if you like, more mainstream. It was once the preserve of the affluent, but much less so nowadays, with prices often, I think, comparable to conventional vacations overseas. But I think life aboard the cruise ships has changed over the years as well. There's generally less formality, which suits a lot of people. Also, growth in specialty restaurants on board many of the ships, where it used to be that passengers would have to eat at a set time in a main restaurant in an allocated seat. That no longer is necessarily the case. In addition, there's lots of outside things which have come on board as well. Specialty coffee shops, that sort of thing, I think, are on board in a lot more abundance as we go on. And in addition to all of that, entertainment's changed, of course, beyond all recognition. Ships have always, certainly in recent years, had their own theatre companies and so on, which put on great entertainment, have done for decades. But now, many of the ships have climbing walls, massive water slides, simulated surfing, all that sort of thing. Very elaborate activities that were previously found only on land. So in terms of it being a new golden era, well, I've not really considered that before, really, to be honest. But yeah, I think you could be right. I think probably is.
So Cunard exists today primarily because it was able to meet the challenge that faced it, pivot, and continue on for another day. Today, let's subtract out global pandemics that might have deleterious effects on the cruise industry. But I'm wondering what challenges might be on the horizon for the cruise industry.
I think sustainability in terms of the environment is probably the greatest one at the moment and will be for some years to come. As in any industry, the cruise industry is doing its utmost to find new solutions so that they can move forward in a more sustainable, less environmentally impactful way. That's largely around things to do with new fuels, to do with solar power, wind power, scrubbers, which clean up the emissions before they're actually allowed to go out into the environment, and all of those things. That's all ongoing. And I think that also trickles down to smaller things within the actual ship life itself. So the way in which things are recycled or reused and that kind of thing as well. But also, I think the other important point is what happens to a ship when it's not actually at sea, when it's in port. And there are great strides being made in that sense as well, so that the engines are not continually burning fuel, sending pollutants out into the air when the ship is in port. But of course, that means that some of the ports as well also need to make adjustments so that they've got facilities so that they can actually provide what is needed for the ship to remain functional without needing to actually run its engines to be doing so. So I think there are lots of things which are on the way. That's quite an exciting time in some respects. And I think great strides are being made. But certainly there are other areas which are going to present challenges as well. But certainly that's the main thing I would say at the moment.
Finally, this is a business show. So I'd like to ask, what lessons do you think be learned by the average business person from Basil Smallpiece's time at Cunard?
I think it's quite clear that So Basil Smallpiece needed to make changes. And I think that's an important lesson in its own right. It's identifying where things need to be changed, where there needs to be greater flexibility. But at the same time, I think also what there doesn't need to be is a drastic out with the old, in with the new approach. I think more companies over the years, more recently, have renewed their appreciation, if you like, and their value of their heritage and their past, Cunard actually being one of them. I think as a company, they were less aware of that during the 1960s, 70s and 80s, but in more recent times have placed renewed value on their heritage. So I would say perhaps a slightly more tempered approach to change can sometimes be helpful. It's not always helpful to make such a drastic change that we dismiss what we've achieved in the past.
David Ellery, thank you so much for speaking with me today on Business Movers.
My pleasure.
That was my conversation with David Ellery. His books include RMS Queen Mary, the world's favorite liner, and QE2, the last great liner. From Wondery, this is the final episode of our series on Cunard and Basil Smallpiece. In the next season of Business Movers, it's almost game over for Nintendo of America until the company's president delivers a new game that saves Nintendo and gives birth to an icon, a little Italian plumber known as Mario. If you'd like to learn more about Basil Smallpiece and Cunard, we recommend Of Comets and Queens by Basil Smallpiece, The Only Way to Cross by John Maxton Graham, and Transatlantic by Stephen Fox. A quick note about our dramatizations. In most cases, we can't know everything that happened, but all our reenactments are based on historical research. Business Movers is hosted, edited, and executive produced by me, Lindsey Graham, for Airship. Audio editing by Mohammed Shazib. Sound design by Molly Bach. Music by Lindsey Graham. Additional writing for this episode by Cody Hoffmuck. Associate producer Jake Sampson. Executive producers are William Simpson for Airship and Aaron O'Flaherty, Jenny Lauer-Beckman, and Marshall Louie for Wondery.